Søren Kierkegaard remains a figure whose thought resists easy summary, whose life invites curiosity, and whose questions continue to disturb settled assumptions about existence, truth, and faith. Born into a prosperous merchant family in early 19th century Copenhagen, he devoted his brief life to a single overarching project, awakening his contemporaries to the strenuous inward task of becoming a self. He wrote prolifically, often under pseudonyms, and he challenged the dominant intellectual currents of his time, especially the grand systematic philosophy of Hegel and the comfortable institutional Christianity he saw embodied in the Danish state church. His work explores anxiety, despair, choice, passion, irony, love, and the paradoxes of faith, all with a precision and subtlety that have secured his place as a founding voice in existentialist thought. This episode offers a sustained look at Kierkegaard's central ideas, the contexts that shaped them, and the enduring questions they pose. We will proceed chronologically through his biography, thematically through his concepts, and carefully through his most important texts, maintaining a steady pace suited to long listening. Our aim is neither to evangelize for his conclusions nor to flatten his paradoxes, but to present his thinking as clearly and accurately as possible, so that each listener may reflect on what it means to exist, to choose, and to relate inwardly to truth. Søren Arby Kierkegaard was born on May 5, 1813, in Copenhagen, Denmark, the youngest of 7 children. His father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, had risen from humble origins in rural Jutland to considerable wealth as a hosier and merchant in the capital. The father's success afforded the family comfort, but it also came with a shadow. Michael was deeply religious, shaped by Moravian pietism, and prone to what Kierkegaard later described as melancholy. Family legend, much debated by scholars, holds that as a young shepherd boy on the heath, Michael had cursed God in a moment of cold and desperation, and that he believed this curse hung over his household. Whether or not the story is literally true, the sense of guilt, the weight of introspection, and the seriousness with which faith and sin were regarded in the Kierkegaard home profoundly marked young Søren. By the time he reached adolescence, 5 of his siblings had died, as had his mother, Annie Sørensdatter Lund Kierkegaard, in 1834. The father's expectation that he too would die before reaching middle age created an atmosphere of existential urgency and an acute awareness of mortality. This melancholy inheritance, combined with rigorous intellectual training, set the stage for a life devoted to examining existence from within. Kierkegaard entered the University of Copenhagen in 1830 to study theology, as his father wished. His student years, however, were marked by restlessness and rebellion. He threw himself into the intellectual and social life of the city, attending lectures, frequenting salons, and reading widely in philosophy, literature, and aesthetics. For a time he drifted, neglecting his studies and exploring what he would later characterize as the aesthetic mode of existence. The death of his father in 1838 proved a turning point. Kierkegaard later wrote that this event spurred him to return to his theological studies with renewed seriousness. He completed his dissertation, titled On the Concept of Irony with constant reference to Socrates, in 1841, defending it successfully on September 29th of that year and receiving his magister degree, equivalent to a doctorate in philosophy. The dissertation already shows his preoccupation with indirect communication, irony, and the Socratic method. Socrates, who professed to know nothing and who used questioning to draw out the latent knowledge or ignorance of his interlocutors, would remain a touchstone for Kierkegaard throughout his authorship. The maieutic approach, in which the teacher acts as midwife to the student's own insight rather than simply delivering content, became central to Kierkegaard's strategy for writing philosophy. He understood that truths about how to exist cannot be transmitted like mathematical theorems. They must be appropriated inwardly, lived and chosen. In the same period that Kierkegaard was finishing his degree, his personal life took a dramatic turn. In September 1840, he became engaged to Regine Olsen, a young woman he had known for several years. The engagement was by all accounts one of mutual affection. Regine was intelligent, warm, and from a respectable family. Kierkegaard later wrote that he loved her deeply. Yet almost immediately he began to experience profound doubt about his ability to be a husband. He felt himself unsuited to the ordinary domestic life that marriage entailed. His melancholy, his sense of a secret burden inherited from his father, and his conviction that he was called to a singular intellectual and religious vocation all weighed on him. After nearly a year of inner turmoil, during which he threw himself into his dissertation work and avoided Regine as much as propriety allowed, he broke off the engagement in October 1841. He returned her ring with a letter asking her to forget him and to forgive him for his inability to make her happy. The break was devastating for both parties. Regine protested. Her father was bewildered. Copenhagen society buzzed with speculation. Kierkegaard left for Berlin shortly afterward, ostensibly to study, but also to escape the painful aftermath. Regine eventually married another man, Friedrich Schlegel, but Kierkegaard never ceased to think of her. References to her, veiled and overt, appear throughout his writings. The broken engagement became for him a lived parable of the collision between the universal ethical demand to marry, to fulfill social roles, to live transparently, and the singular religious call that isolated him and demanded renunciation. Upon returning to Copenhagen in 1842, Kierkegaard embarked on an extraordinarily productive period of writing. His inheritance from his father gave him financial independence, and he devoted himself entirely to authorship. Between 1843 and 1846, he published a remarkable series of works, most of them under pseudonyms. The Pseudonymous Strategy was deliberate and carefully managed. Kierkegaard wanted to create a polyphonic literature in which different voices, representing different life views or stages of existence, could speak in their own idiom without the author standing behind them to endorse or correct. Each pseudonym has a distinct personality, style, and philosophical position. Victor Eremita is the editor of Either Or, a work presenting contrasting aesthetic and ethical viewpoints. Johannes de Silentio, whose name means John the Silent, is the author of Fear and Trembling, a meditation on faith and Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. Constantine Constantius explores repetition. Vigilius Haufniensis, meaning watchman of Copenhagen, writes the concept of anxiety. Johannes Climacus, named after a medieval monk who wrote The Ladder of Divine Ascent, authors both philosophical fragments and the concluding unscientific postscript, massive works examining the nature of faith and subjective truth. Judge William appears in Either Or and Stages, On Life's Way, as the voice of ethical commitment and married life. Anticlimacus, used for the sickness unto death and practice in Christianity, represents a standpoint of idealized Christianity that Kierkegaard himself did not claim to embody, hence the pseudonym. Alongside these pseudonymous works, Kierkegaard published a series of upbuilding or edifying discourses under his own name. These were explicitly religious and devotional, addressed to that single individual, a phrase that became his hallmark. The use of pseudonyms serves multiple purposes. First, it allows Kierkegaard to present ideas without directly advocating them, thus practicing the indirect communication he admired in Socrates. If a reader encounters the aesthetic life view articulated brilliantly by the young man in Either Or, the reader must decide for himself whether that view is sustainable or whether it collapses into despair. Kierkegaard does not appear in the text to tell the reader what to think. Second, the pseudonyms create aesthetic distance. The ideas are dramatized. embodied in characters with particular temperaments and circumstances. This makes the philosophy vivid and personal rather than abstract. Third, the strategy respects the freedom and subjectivity of the reader. Kierkegaard believed that the worst thing a communicator could do was to overwhelm the reader with authority, to impose truth from without. Truth, especially truth about existence and faith, must be appropriated by the individual through inward struggle. By hiding behind pseudonyms, Kierkegaard removes his own personality from the equation and forces the reader to engage with the ideas themselves. Finally, the pseudonyms reflect Kierkegaard's conviction that there is no single neutral standpoint from which to survey all of existence. Each stage or mode of life has its own logic, its own language, its own passions. To understand them, one must enter into them, and the pseudonyms are vehicles for that imaginative entry. At the heart of Kierkegaard's philosophical project is a distinction between objective and subjective truth. Objective truth concerns facts that hold regardless of who believes them or how they are appropriated. Mathematical propositions, historical dates, and empirical observations belong to the realm of objective truth. Such truths can be communicated directly, verified by evidence, and known with a high degree of certainty. Subjective truth, by contrast, concerns the individual's relationship to what is known. It is not enough to know that God exists, or that Christ lived, or that death is inevitable. One must relate oneself to these truths inwardly, with passion, commitment, and personal appropriation. Subjective truth is lived truth. Kierkegaard often quotes the line, "If a person does not become what he understands, then he does not understand it either." This means that understanding in the existential sense is not merely intellectual assent, but transformation of one's being. One can memorize Christian doctrine without being a Christian. One can know ethical principles without living ethically. The decisive question is not what one knows, but how one knows it, how one exists in relation to it. This is why Kierkegaard insists that subjectivity is truth. He does not mean that each person invents his own truth, or that there is no objective reality. He means that for questions of how to live, for religious and ethical existence, the inward mode of appropriation is what matters. A person who holds an objective uncertainty, such as the paradox of the incarnation, with infinite passion is in truth, while a person who knows all the right answers but remains inwardly indifferent is in error. The concept of inwardness is closely related. Inwardness refers to the quality of one's inner life, the depth and intensity of one's self-relationship, the earnestness with which one reflects on one's own existence. In a culture that prizes public achievement, social approval, and objective knowledge, inwardness is easily neglected. Kierkegaard saw his contemporaries as living in crowds, absorbed in external roles, defined by what others think, and estranged from their own subjectivity. To cultivate inwardness means to withdraw from the crowd, to take responsibility for one's choices, to reflect honestly on one's motives, fears, and commitments. It requires solitude, honesty, and courage. Inwardness is not introspection for its own sake, nor is it a retreat from action. Rather, it is the condition for authentic action. Only the person who knows himself, who has faced his own despair and chosen himself in earnest, can act ethically and religiously. Without inwardness, life becomes mechanical, external, a matter of going through the motions. With inwardness, even ordinary actions take on significance because they are performed by a self that has awakened to its own existence. Kierkegaard's analysis of existence is organized around three stages or spheres: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. These are not developmental stages through which everyone passes in sequence, nor are they exclusive categories. A person can oscillate between them or remain stuck in one. They are better understood as modes of existence, ways of organizing one's life, sources of meaning and identity. Each stage has its own logic, its own satisfactions, and its own form of despair. The movement from one stage to another is not achieved by argument or by accumulating more knowledge. It requires a leap, a decision, an act of will in which the individual breaks with the past and commits to a new way of being. This leap is not irrational, but it is not purely rational either. It involves the whole self, passion as well as thought, risk as well as reflection. The aesthetic stage is characterized by the pursuit of immediate experience, pleasure, variety, and the avoidance of boredom and commitment. The aesthetic individual lives in the moment, seeking to maximize enjoyment and minimize pain. He values beauty, novelty, sensory delight, and emotional intensity. He may be a hedonist indulging in physical pleasures, or he may be a refined connoisseur cultivating taste and imagination. The archetype of the aesthetic life is the seducer, who pursues romantic and erotic conquests, not for the sake of any particular woman, but for the thrill of the chase, the aesthetic satisfaction of orchestrating desire. In Either Or, the first volume presents the aesthetic view through the writings of a young man known simply as A. This character writes essays on music, particularly Mozart's Don Giovanni, on the tragic in ancient drama, on the rotation method for avoiding boredom, and on the art of seduction. His writing is brilliant, witty, and melancholy. He understands pleasure and beauty with sophistication. Yet beneath the surface there is an emptiness. The aesthetic life, because it depends on external circumstances and fleeting moods, is inherently unstable. The aesthete is at the mercy of chance. When pleasure fades, as it inevitably does, he is left with boredom and despair. He has no stable identity, no continuity, no purpose beyond the next experience. He floats, drifts, and ultimately suffers from what Kierkegaard calls despair, though the aesthete may not recognize it as such. He may call it ennui, melancholy, or simply the way things are. But it is a fundamental unhappiness rooted in the refusal to choose oneself, to commit, to take responsibility for one's existence. The ethical stage represents a decisive break with the aesthetic. The ethical individual recognizes that life cannot be organized around pleasure or novelty. Instead, it must be grounded in duty, responsibility, and commitment. The ethical person chooses himself in his concrete historical situation and accepts the obligations that come with being a self. He commits to roles: husband, father, citizen, professional. He lives according to universal moral principles. He values honesty, fidelity, justice, and consistency. In Either Or, the ethical view is articulated by Judge William, a married magistrate who writes long letters to the young aesthete, urging him to marry, to choose, to live earnestly. Judge William argues that marriage is the highest expression of the ethical life because it involves a total, lifelong commitment to another person and to the responsibilities of family and social life. He contrasts the Don Juan figure, who moves from one affair to another without ever committing, with the faithful husband who finds depth and continuity through commitment. The ethical life has a seriousness and dignity that the aesthetic lacks. It provides stability, meaning, and a sense of identity. The ethical person knows who he is because he has chosen himself and taken responsibility for that choice. He is transparent, integrated, and capable of genuine relationships. Yet the ethical stage, for all its strengths, has its own limitations and its own form of despair. The ethical individual can become self-righteous, confident that his adherence to universal principles justifies him. He can lose sight of his own contingency, his own sinfulness, his own radical dependence on something beyond the universal moral order. When confronted with the absoluteness of religious demands, or with situations in which universal ethical principles collide, the ethical individual may find that duty is not enough, The religious stage is the highest and most paradoxical. Here the individual stands in absolute relation to the absolute, to God, and discovers that this relation transcends and can even suspend the universal ethical order. The religious individual is defined not by aesthetic pleasure or ethical duty, but by faith, by an inward passion directed toward the infinite and eternal. Faith is not a matter of intellectual assent to doctrines. It is not confidence based on evidence or probability. It is a leap, a risk, a commitment made in the face of objective uncertainty. The religious person accepts that God is wholly other, that divine commands may not align with human reason or ethics, and that the relationship with God is intensely personal, hidden, and inward. This does not mean that the religious person abandons ethics or aesthetics. Rather, he holds them in a new context, subordinated to the absolute relationship with God. Kierkegaard explores the religious stage most vividly in Fear and Trembling, a work that meditates on the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac on Mount Moriah. From the perspective of universal ethics, this is murder, an abominable crime. Abraham cannot explain his action to others. He cannot appeal to a higher ethical principle. He acts in silence, in fear and trembling, on the strength of faith alone. He believes that by virtue of the absurd, he will get Isaac back, that God who gave the command will somehow make it right, and in the event God does intervene, providing a ram for the sacrifice and sparing Isaac. Abraham becomes the father of faith, the knight of faith, the one who makes the teleological suspension of the ethical. This phrase, teleological suspension of the ethical, is central to Kierkegaard's account of the religious stage. Telos means purpose or end. Abraham suspends the universal ethical prohibition against murder because he has a higher telos, a divine purpose that transcends ethics. This is not a permanent abolition of ethics. It is a suspension, a momentary setting aside in the face of an absolute command from the absolute. The concept is deeply troubling and has provoked endless debate. Does it mean that religious faith can justify any action, no matter how horrible? Kierkegaard is careful to distinguish faith from fanaticism. Abraham is not a madman. He does not act out of delusion or self-interest. He acts in obedience to a divine command that he receives inwardly, and he does so with full awareness of the ethical horror of what he is being asked to do. His faith is not blind, it is acutely conscious. Moreover, the teleological suspension applies only to the knight of faith, not to those who remain in the ethical sphere. For most people, most of the time, the ethical universal remains authoritative. The suspension is rare, exceptional, and paradoxical. It cannot be generalized or used as a license for immorality. What Kierkegaard wants to convey is that faith is not reducible to ethics, that the religious life involves a relationship with God that can place the individual in positions of absolute solitude and absolute responsibility, positions that the ethical categories cannot capture. Kierkegaard contrasts the knight of faith with the knight of infinite resignation. The knight of infinite resignation makes the movement of withdrawing from finite hopes and attachments. He gives up the beloved, the worldly goal, the particular desire, and finds peace in an eternal relationship or in the idea of the infinite. This is a movement of renunciation, noble and tragic. The knight of faith, however, makes a further movement. He renounces everything, just as the knight of resignation does, but then he believes that by virtue of the absurd, he will receive it back in this life, in time, in finitude. He lives in the finite world, enjoys its goods, loves his wife, cares for his children, and yet at the same time he holds all of it in absolute relation to God. He looks like anyone else. There is nothing outwardly to distinguish him, but inwardly he has made the double movement of faith, and this makes him the highest expression of human existence. The Knight of Faith embodies what Kierkegaard calls repetition, a concept he explores in the work of that title. Repetition is not simple recurrence or going back. It is a forward movement in which one receives back what one has renounced, but transformed, made new, held in a new way. It is the opposite of recollection, which is a backward movement toward the eternal past. Repetition is the movement of faith, the movement of life itself, the yes to existence that affirms both finitude and infinity, both time and eternity, both suffering and joy. Anxiety is another concept that Kierkegaard explores with penetrating depth, particularly in The Concept of Anxiety, authored by Vigilius Haufniensis. Anxiety, or angst, is not the same as fear. Fear has a definite object. One fears a snake, a storm, a hostile person. Anxiety, by contrast, is objectless, a diffuse unease directed at nothing in particular. Kierkegaard describes anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. It arises when the self confronts the open horizon of possibility, the fact that it must choose and that every choice carries the weight of responsibility. In the moment before a choice, the self experiences anxiety because it is aware of its freedom and its finitude simultaneously. It can do many things, but it cannot do everything, and whatever it chooses will exclude other possibilities. Anxiety reveals the burden of selfhood. To be a self is to be responsible for oneself, to have to choose, to stand alone before the abyss of one's own freedom. This is why anxiety is both frightening and fascinating. It is the symptom of spirit awakening to itself. An animal does not experience anxiety because it does not have spirit. It lives in immediacy, governed by instinct. A human being, however, is a synthesis of body and soul, finite and infinite, temporal and eternal. Spirit is the self-relating relation that holds this synthesis together. When spirit stirs, the self becomes aware of its task to become itself, and this awareness brings anxiety. Kierkegaard traces anxiety to the story of the fall in Genesis. Adam, before the first sin, is in a state of innocence, but this innocence is also ignorance. He does not yet know good and evil. God gives him a command: do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the command, Adam becomes aware of possibility. The prohibition introduces the idea of transgression. Adam does not understand what it means to disobey because he is innocent, but the mere awareness that he can disobey awakens anxiety. This anxiety is what Kierkegaard calls the presupposition of sin. It is not itself sin, but it is the condition in which sin becomes possible. In anxiety, freedom gazes down into its own possibility, and this gaze is ambiguous. Freedom is attracted to the possibility it fears. It wants to actualize itself, to make a choice, to leap, but it also recoils from the responsibility that comes with choosing. Anxiety is thus simultaneously a shrinking back and a reaching forward. It is the condition of every human being who has not yet chosen himself in earnestness or who has not yet made the leap of faith. Anxiety is overcome only by going through it, by choosing, by accepting guilt and responsibility, and ultimately by resting transparently in the power that established the self, which is to say God. Until then, anxiety remains the mark of human existence, the ambiguous feeling that accompanies the task of becoming a self. Despair is the theme of The Sickness Unto Death, a work that may be Kierkegaard's most psychologically acute. Despair, like anxiety, is a universal condition, though not everyone recognizes it. Kierkegaard defines the self as a relation that relates itself to itself and, in relating itself to itself, relates itself to another. The self is not a substance or a fixed entity. It is a dynamic relation, a synthesis of opposites held together by spirit. Specifically, the The self is a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, necessity and possibility, body and soul. Despair arises when this synthesis is disturbed, when one element is out of balance, or when the self refuses to be itself. Because the self is a task, not a given, despair is the condition of not being rightly related to oneself. It is the sickness unto death, because it does not kill the body but torments the self endlessly. The despairing person cannot rid himself of the self. He is stuck with himself, yet he does not want to be himself or cannot be himself. Despair is thus a form of internal contradiction, a state in which the self is at odds with itself. Kierkegaard distinguishes several forms of despair. The most common and the most hidden is the despair of not being conscious that one has a self at all. This is the despair of immediacy, of living in the aesthetic stage, absorbed in externals, defined entirely by social roles, pleasures, or worldly concerns. The person in this state does not recognize that he is in despair. He may even think he is happy, but his happiness is fragile, dependent on circumstances, and he has no stable self to fall back on when things go wrong. Then there is the despair of not willing to be oneself. This form of despair involves the wish to escape one's own identity, to be someone else, to shed the burdens and limits of one's particular existence. It is the despair of weakness, of passivity, of refusing the task of becoming a self. It can manifest as depression, resignation, or a constant flight into distraction. Conversely, there is the despair of willing to be oneself in defiance, willing to be oneself on one's own terms, by one's own power. This is the despair of strength, of pride, of the demonic. The person in this state refuses to accept his dependence on God or on the power that established him. He insists on autonomy, on being self-made, self-sufficient, but because the self is fundamentally a derived relation, this form of despair is doomed to failure. The self cannot ground itself. The attempt to do so leads to a kind of internal tyranny, a hardening, a closing off from grace. All forms of despair, according to Kierkegaard, are ultimately sin. This does not mean moral wrongdoing in the ordinary sense. It means the condition of being separated from God, of being in a wrong relationship to the power that established the self. Sin is not primarily a matter of particular bad actions, though it expresses itself in actions. Sin is a state of being, a condition of the will. It is the unwillingness to rest transparently in God, the refusal to accept one's creaturely status and one's need for grace. Despair is overcome only when the self wills to be itself and grounds that willing in God. This is faith. Faith is the opposite of despair. In faith, the self accepts itself as it is, with all its limits and contradictions, and entrusts itself to the power that created it. In faith, the self becomes transparent, open, no longer at war with itself. This does not mean that anxiety and despair disappear entirely. They remain as possibilities, as temptations, as the shadow side of freedom. But the self that rests in faith is no longer ruled by them. It has found the ground of its existence and can live in earnest. The relationship between the aesthetic, ethical, and religious stages and the concepts of anxiety and despair is complex. One can experience despair in any stage. The aesthete despairs because he has no stable self and depends on external circumstances. The ethical person can despair when he realizes that his own efforts are insufficient, that he is guilty before God, that universal principles do not answer the deepest questions of existence. The religious person can despair if his faith falters, if he loses sight of God, if he becomes conscious of his own sin. But in the religious stage, despair is transformed. It is no longer hidden or denied. It is acknowledged, brought into the light, and confronted in relation to God. The religious person knows that he is a sinner, that he is in despair, and that only by the grace of God can he be saved. This recognition is itself a form of faith. It is the condition of honesty, of transparency before God, and it opens the way to healing. Kierkegaard returns again and again to the figure of Socrates, not only in his dissertation on irony, but throughout his authorship. Socrates represents the ethical existential thinker par excellence. He is not interested in building systems or accumulating objective knowledge. He is interested in the examined life, in helping people to know themselves, to recognize their ignorance, and to take responsibility for how they live. Socrates uses irony, questioning, and indirect communication to provoke his interlocutors. He does not lecture, he converses. He does not claim to know the answers, he professes ignorance. Yet through his questioning, he reveals the contradictions and illusions in the thinking of those around him. This maieutic method, the method of midwifery, is designed to bring the truth to birth in the soul of the learner. It respects the learner's freedom and subjectivity. It does not impose answers, but draws them out. Kierkegaard adopts this method in his own writing, using pseudonyms, indirect communication, irony, and paradox to engage the reader's inwardness rather than simply transmitting information. He wants the reader to struggle, to question, to choose. He does not want passive consumers of ideas, but active thinkers who appropriate truth for themselves. The concept of the single individual is another thread that runs through Kierkegaard's work. He is deeply suspicious of the crowd, the public, the mass. In the crowd, individuals lose themselves. They become anonymous, irresponsible, absorbed into a collective that thinks and acts for them. The crowd has no conscience, no inwardness, no capacity for genuine decision. It is a kind of abstraction, untruth. Truth, by contrast, is always personal, individual, inward. Kierkegaard dedicates many of his works to that single individual, a phrase that signals his respect for the reader as a unique, responsible, solitary self. He does not write for the masses or for posterity. He writes for the one who is willing to read slowly, to think deeply, to take the ideas to heart. The single individual is the one who has the courage to stand alone, to choose himself, to live before God rather than before public opinion. This does not mean isolation or contempt for others. It means taking responsibility for one's own existence and recognizing that no one else can live one's life for one. The single individual is both the task and the achievement of authentic existence. Kierkegaard's relationship to Hegelian philosophy is one of critical engagement. Hegel was the dominant philosophical figure in Europe during Kierkegaard's lifetime, and his influence extended into theology, aesthetics, politics, and history. Hegel's philosophy is systematic, comprehensive, and confident. It claims to show how reality unfolds according to a rational dialectical process, how contradictions are synthesized into higher unities, how history progresses toward the realization of absolute spirit, and how all particular truths are comprehended within the absolute truth of the system. Kierkegaard found this approach deeply problematic. He objects to the pretense of standing outside existence, of achieving a God's eye view, of reducing lived experience to abstract concepts. He argues that existence cannot be thought. Existence is concrete, temporal, individual, and passionate. It involves risk, choice, suffering, and uncertainty. It cannot be captured in a system. The Hegelian philosopher tries to mediate all contradictions, to smooth out all paradoxes, to subsume the individual under the universal. But in doing so, he loses sight of what it means to exist. He forgets the inwardness, the subjectivity, the anxiety, the despair, the faith. He forgets the single individual. Kierkegaard's pseudonym, Johannes Climacus, in the concluding unscientific postscript, mounts a sustained critique of the Hegelian project. He argues that objective knowledge, the knowledge sought by science and systematic philosophy, has its place, but it is not relevant to the question of how to exist. The question of how to exist is an existential question, not a speculative one. It requires decision, passion, and commitment, not more information. Climacus famously says that truth is subjectivity, not because there is no objective truth, but because for existential questions the mode of appropriation is decisive. He also emphasizes the importance of holding truth in uncertainty. Faith is not the result of proof. It is a leap made in the absence of proof, a commitment sustained by passion rather than by evidence. The person who waits for certainty before committing will never commit. The person who tries to understand existence from the outside, objectively, will never become a subject, will never exist inwardly. Climacus uses humour, irony, and rhetorical flourishes to undermine the pretensions of the speculative philosopher and to invite the reader into a different kind of thinking, one that is personal, earnest, and aware of its own limits. Kierkegaard's critique of the Danish church, known as the attack on Christendom, occupies the final years of his life and represents a shift in his communicative strategy. Up until 1848, Kierkegaard had written primarily pseudonymously, indirectly, addressing individuals inwardly. After 1848, he began to write more directly, under his own name, and with increasing urgency. The immediate occasion for the attack was the death of Jacob Peter Mynster in 1854. Mynster had been the primate of the Danish Lutheran Church, a respected bishop, and a figure whom Kierkegaard's father had revered. Kierkegaard himself had complex feelings about Mynster. He respected the man personally, but had long been troubled by what he saw as Mynster's accommodation to worldliness. When Hans Martensen, Mynster's successor, gave a memorial sermon in which he praised Mynster as a witness to the truth, Kierkegaard felt compelled to speak out. He argued that Mynster was not a witness to the truth in the New Testament sense. A witness to the truth, in Christian terms, is one who suffers for the faith, who lives in poverty and humility, who is persecuted by the world. Mynster, by contrast, had enjoyed comfort, honour, and a prominent social position. He had preached Christianity in beautiful sermons, but he had not lived it radically. He had presided over a church that had become indistinguishable from the culture around it. This critique of Mynster opened the floodgates to a broader attack on the Danish church and on the concept of Christendom itself. Kierkegaard published a series of articles in a periodical called The Instant, and he gave speeches and wrote pamphlets denouncing the state church. He argued that Christendom, the fusion of church and state, the situation in which everyone is automatically a Christian by virtue of being born in a Christian country, is a betrayal of New Testament Christianity. True Christianity, according to Kierkegaard, is demanding, personal, and inward. It requires renunciation, suffering, and faith. It cannot be inherited or assumed. Yet in Christendom, Christianity has become comfortable, respectable, and nominal. The clergy are civil servants with secure salaries and social status. The laity attend church out of habit or social expectation, not out of genuine faith. The radical demands of the gospel are softened, explained away, or ignored. Everyone congratulates themselves on being Christians, but no one seriously tries to follow Christ. This, for Kierkegaard, is an illusion, a massive collective self-deception, and it is worse than overt paganism because it inoculates people against real Christianity. If you think you are already a Christian, you will not seek to become one. Kierkegaard's attack was fierce and uncompromising. He called the clergy hypocrites. He questioned the sacraments as administered in the state church, and he urged people to stop going to church if it meant participating in the illusion of Christendom. His language was harsh, his tone sometimes bitter. Many contemporaries were scandalized, and many dismissed him as a fanatic or a crank. Yet Kierkegaard insisted that he was being faithful to the New Testament, that he was simply pointing out the obvious discrepancy between what the New Testament demands and what the Danish church practiced. He did not claim to be an exemplary Christian himself. In fact, he described himself as without authority, as someone who was pointing to the ideal without pretending to have achieved it. This honesty about his own shortcomings gives his critique a certain moral force. He is not condemning others from a position of self-righteousness. He is acknowledging the gap between the ideal and the reality, a gap in which he himself stands, and he is calling for honesty about that gap. The attack took a toll on Kierkegaard's health and his reputation. In October 1855, he collapsed on the street and was taken to the hospital. He died on November 11th, 1855, at the age of 42. His death was controversial. The church wanted to give him a Christian burial, but some of his followers objected, arguing that he had repudiated the church. In the end, the burial proceeded, but not without incident. Kierkegaard left behind a massive body of work, much of it still unpublished at the time of his death, including voluminous journals in which he reflected on his authorship, his intentions, and his inner struggles. Kierkegaard's legacy took time to unfold. During his lifetime, he was known primarily in Denmark, and even there he was a controversial and somewhat marginal figure. His works were not widely translated into other languages until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. German translations began to appear in the 1870s and 1880s, and gradually his ideas reached a broader European audience. The existentialist philosophers of the 20th century, figures such as Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Albert Camus, read Kierkegaard and drew on his concepts of anxiety, despair, authenticity, choice, and the absurd. Protestant theologians, especially Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, and Rudolf Bultmann, engaged deeply with Kierkegaard's critique of Christendom and his account of faith as paradox and inwardness. Psychologists and psychiatrists, including Ludwig Binswanger and Rollo May, found in Kierkegaard's phenomenology of anxiety and despair rich resources for understanding the human condition. Literary critics and philosophers of religion continue to study his work for its stylistic brilliance, its philosophical rigor, and its profound insight into the struggles of existence. Today, Kierkegaard is recognized as one of the major figures in Western philosophy, a thinker whose questions remain urgent and whose voice remains distinctive. One of Kierkegaard's most important ethical works, published under his own name, is Works of Love. This book, published in 1847, explores Christian love, or neighbor love, in contrast to preferential love, romantic love, and friendship. Kierkegaard argues that Christian love is commanded. It is not a feeling that arises spontaneously. It is a duty that is laid upon us by the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. This does not mean that Christian love is cold or mechanical. It means that it does not depend on the qualities of the beloved, on reciprocity, on attraction, or on emotion. It is a love that is unconditional, universal, and directed toward every human being as such. The neighbor is not the person we naturally like or feel drawn to. The neighbor is anyone, everyone, the person we encounter, including the stranger, the enemy, the one who does not return our love. To love the neighbor as oneself means to will the good for the other in the same way and with the same seriousness that one wills it for oneself. It means to see the other as equally created by God, equally worthy of love, equally a self with infinite worth. Kierkegaard distinguishes this neighbor love from erotic love and from friendship, which are forms of preferential love. Erotic love is directed toward the beloved because of her unique qualities, her beauty, her charm, the feelings she awakens in the lover. It is passionate, exclusive, and self-interested in the sense that the lover desires the beloved for himself. Friendship is similarly preferential, based on mutual affinity, shared interests, and reciprocal affection. Both erotic love and friendship are natural, beautiful, and important parts of human life, but they are not commanded, and they are not universal. One cannot be commanded to fall in love or to form friendships because these depend on inclination and mutual recognition. But one can be commanded to love the neighbor because this love is an act of will, a decision, a commitment that does not depend on feeling. Kierkegaard is not opposed to erotic love or friendship. He does not advocate a loveless austerity, but he insists that these forms of love must be transformed and deepened by the commandment to love the neighbor. Erotic love and friendship must be purified of self-seeking, possessiveness, and exclusivity. They must become vehicles of neighbor love, ways of serving the good of the other rather than satisfying the self. Works of love is structured as a series of deliberations, each taking up a different aspect of the commandment to love. Kierkegaard examines what it means to see love's hidden life, to love the dead, to build up the other, to forgive, to believe all things and hope all things about the beloved. He meditates on the patience of love, the mercy of love, the victory of love in being defeated. The tone is devotional, earnest, and searching. Kierkegaard is not presenting a systematic ethics so much as inviting the reader into a reflective engagement with the demands and paradoxes of Christian love. One of the central paradoxes is that neighbor love is both a duty and the highest freedom. It is commanded, yet it must be freely chosen. It is universal, yet it is deeply personal. It is hidden, inward, a matter of the heart, yet it expresses itself in concrete actions. Love does not advertise itself. It does not seek recognition or reward. It works in secret, known only to God. The person who truly loves the neighbor does not congratulate himself on his virtue. He does not compare himself favorably to others. He is aware of his own failures and his dependence on grace. Kierkegaard also addresses the question of self-love. The commandment says to love your neighbor as yourself, which presupposes a proper self-love. But what is proper self-love? It is not selfishness or narcissism. It is not the pursuit of one's own pleasure or advantage at the expense of others. Proper self-love, for Kierkegaard, means recognizing oneself as created by God, as a self with the task of becoming a self, and willing one's own good in a way that is consistent with willing the good of the neighbor. It means taking responsibility for one's own existence, cultivating one's inwardness, and striving to become the person God intends one to be. This self-love is not in competition with neighbor love. On the contrary, the two are inseparable. To love oneself rightly is to love oneself as a neighbor, and to love the neighbor is to recognize in the neighbor the same God-given worth and task that one recognizes in oneself. The person who despises himself, who is in despair, who refuses to be himself, cannot genuinely love the neighbor because he is not rightly related to himself. Conversely, the person who loves only himself, who is closed off from others, who sees others as means to his own ends, does not truly love himself because he has cut himself off from the source of love, which is God. Throughout works of love, Kierkegaard returns to the theme of hiddenness. Love is not something that can be seen directly. One cannot open another person's heart to inspect their motives. One cannot measure love by external actions alone, because the same action can be done from different motives. A person might give alms out of genuine compassion or out of a desire for praise. A person might care for a sick relative out of love or out of duty grudgingly performed. The inwardness of love means that it is known ultimately only to God. This has important implications. It means that we cannot judge whether another person loves. It means that love does not seek to prove itself to others. It means that the highest form of love may be invisible, unknown, unrecognized by the world. The person who loves in secret, who forgives without telling, who serves without being noticed, embodies the Christian ideal. This inwardness also means that love is a matter of faith. We cannot see love directly, but we can believe in it. To believe all things and hope all things about the beloved, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, is to maintain faith in the presence of love even when it is hidden, even when appearances suggest otherwise. This is a form of trust, a kind of epistemic humility, and a refusal to give in to suspicion and cynicism. Kierkegaard's account of love is demanding. It calls for a transformation of the will, a reorientation of the self, a commitment to the other that does not waver. It is not sentimental or easy. It does not promise happiness or fulfillment in worldly terms. It promises the struggle, the suffering, and the hiddenness that come with genuine love. Yet it also promises the deepest form of meaning and the highest form of human existence. To love the neighbor is to participate in the divine love, to become an instrument of God's love in the world. It is to move beyond the self and its narrow concerns and to live in relation to the infinite. This is the ethical and religious culmination of Kierkegaard's thought. It is not enough to choose oneself, to live ethically, or even to have faith in the abstract. One must love. And love, as Kierkegaard describes it, is both the simplest and the most difficult thing in the world. Another work that deserves close attention is Practice in Christianity, published in 1850 under the pseudonym Anticlimacus. This work explores what it means to be a Christian, to follow Christ, to imitate the God-man. Anticlimacus is presented as an idealized Christian, someone who holds up the New Testament standard without compromise. Kierkegaard, by using this pseudonym, signals that he himself does not claim to meet the standard. He is not Anticlimacus. He is merely the editor, the one who presents the ideal for others to consider. Practice in Christianity emphasizes the paradox of the incarnation, the offense that Christ represents, and the costliness of discipleship. Christ is not a sage, a moral teacher, or a religious genius in the ordinary sense. He is the God-man, the eternal entering time, the infinite becoming finite. This is an absolute paradox that cannot be comprehended by reason. It can only be believed. Moreover, Christ is a sign of contradiction. He comes in lowliness, poverty, and suffering. He does not look like God. He looks like a man, a carpenter's son, a wandering preacher without credentials or power. To recognize him as God requires faith. To follow him requires renunciation, suffering, and a willingness to be scorned by the world. Anticlimacus contrasts the Christianity of the New Testament with the Christianity of Christendom. In the New Testament, to be a Christian is to be a disciple, a follower of Christ, one who takes up the cross and walks the narrow way. It is to expect persecution, misunderstanding, and rejection. It is to live in tension with the world, to be in the world, but not of the world. In Christendom, by contrast, Christianity has been domesticated. It has become a cultural norm, a badge of respectability, a source of comfort and social cohesion. Everyone is a Christian, but no one suffers for it. The church is established, wealthy, and honoured. The clergy are comfortable. The faithful attend services, but do not let their faith disrupt their worldly pursuits. This, according to Anticlimacus, is a betrayal of the gospel. It is an illusion that must be exposed. The way to expose it is to hold up the New Testament standard, to remind people of what Christ actually said and did, and to ask honestly whether what we call Christianity today bears any resemblance to that. The answer, more often than not, is no. This does not mean that everyone must become a martyr or a monk. It does mean that one must be honest about the gap between the ideal and the reality, and one must not deceive oneself into thinking that nominal Christianity is sufficient. practice in Christianity also explores the concept of contemporaneity with Christ. Kierkegaard argues that faith is not historical knowledge. It is not a matter of accepting that a man named Jesus lived 2,000 years ago and did certain things. Faith is a matter of becoming contemporary with Christ, of encountering him in the present, of deciding for oneself whether to believe and follow. The passage of time does not make faith easier. In some ways it makes it harder, because the scandal and offence of the Incarnation are smoothed over by tradition, art, theology, and cultural familiarity. The person living in Christendom has been told from childhood that Jesus is the Son of God, that Christianity is true, that the Church is trustworthy. All of this can insulate the person from the genuine encounter with Christ. To become contemporary with Christ means to strip away all of these mediations, to imagine oneself standing in Galilee or Jerusalem, seeing this man who claims to be God, and deciding whether to believe. It means confronting the paradox, the offence, the risk. It means recognizing that faith is not a matter of inheriting a tradition, but of making a personal, inward decision in the face of objective uncertainty. The concept of offence is central to practice in Christianity. Kierkegaard identifies two forms of offence. The first is the offence of lowliness. Christ appears in weakness, poverty, and humility. He does not look like what one would expect God to look like. He does not perform miracles on demand. He does not establish an earthly kingdom. He suffers and dies on a cross. For those who expect power, glory, and majesty, this is offensive. It does not fit their concept of divinity. The second form of offence is the offence of loftiness. Christ claims to be God. He claims to forgive sins. He claims authority over the law, over the Sabbath, over life and death. For those who believe in the absolute distinction between God and man, this is blasphemous. It is an intolerable claim. Both forms of offence are intrinsic to the Incarnation. One cannot remove them without removing Christ himself. Faith begins precisely at the point of offence. It is the decision to believe in spite of the offence, to see in this lowly, suffering man the presence of God, to entrust oneself to him in fear and trembling. This is not irrational, but it is not rational either. It is a decision of the whole person, a leap, a commitment sustained by passion rather than by proof. Kierkegaard's relationship to philosophy and theology is complex. He is often classified as an existentialist, and there is good reason for this. He emphasizes existence over essence, subjectivity over objectivity, individual choice over universal systems, and the concrete over the abstract. He anticipates many of the themes that later existentialists would develop, including anxiety, freedom, authenticity, the absurd, and the confrontation with death. Yet he is also a deeply Christian thinker. His existentialism is not atheistic or nihilistic. It is oriented toward faith, toward God, toward the eternal. He does not believe that existence is meaningless, or that one must create one's own values in a godless universe. He believes that the self finds its ground and its fulfillment in relation to God. His existentialism is thus a theistic existentialism, and it cannot be understood apart from his Christian commitments. At the same time, his Christianity is not orthodox in a simple sense. He is critical of the Church, suspicious of theology as a system, and insistent on the inwardness and paradoxicality of faith. He does not fit neatly into any theological camp. He is neither a liberal Protestant who reduces Christianity to ethics and culture, nor a conservative who insists on doctrinal correctness and ecclesiastical authority. He is a singular voice, a gadfly, a corrective, someone who asks uncomfortable questions and refuses to let anyone rest in complacency. The reception of Kierkegaard's work has been varied. In the early 20th century, existentialist philosophers and theologians embraced him as a precursor and a kindred spirit. Heidegger's analysis of anxiety, being toward death, and authenticity in being and time owes a debt to Kierkegaard, though Heidegger rarely acknowledged it. Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom, choice, and the burden of existence echoes Kierkegaardian themes, though Sartre removes the religious dimension and replaces it with atheistic humanism. Camus' exploration of the absurd, particularly in the myth of Sisyphus, engages directly with Kierkegaard's concept of the leap of faith, though Camus rejects the leap and opts instead for a defiant acceptance of absurdity. Jaspers, a German psychiatrist and philosopher, drew extensively on Kierkegaard's insights into existential psychology and the limits of reason. In theology, Karl Barth's dialectical theology, with its emphasis on the radical otherness of God, the crisis of human existence, and the paradox of revelation, reflects Kierkegaard's influence. Barth famously said that Kierkegaard's critique of Christendom was prophetic and that the Church needed to hear it. Paul Tillich incorporated Kierkegaardian concepts of anxiety, courage, and the courage to be into his theological anthropology. Rudolf Bultmann's program of demythologization and his emphasis on existential interpretation of the New Testament likewise show Kierkegaard's impact. In psychology, the influence of Kierkegaard can be seen in existential and humanistic psychology. Rollo May, an American psychologist, wrote extensively on anxiety, citing Kierkegaard as a primary source. May argued that modern psychology had neglected the existential dimension of human experience, the questions of meaning, freedom, and death, and that Kierkegaard's phenomenology of anxiety offered crucial insights. Viktor Frankl, the founder of logotherapy, emphasized the search for meaning as the central human motivation, a theme resonant with Kierkegaard's insistence that one must choose oneself and live with purpose. R.D. Laing, a Scottish psychiatrist known for his work on schizophrenia and the politics of mental illness, drew on Kierkegaard's account of the divided self and the experience of ontological insecurity. Even Sigmund Freud, who did not directly engage with Kierkegaard, shares some thematic overlaps, particularly in the exploration of inner conflict, guilt, and the unconscious. However, Freud's deterministic framework and his emphasis on the drives stand in contrast to Kierkegaard's emphasis on freedom and choice. In literary studies, Kierkegaard is appreciated for his stylistic innovation, his use of pseudonyms, his mastery of irony and indirect communication, and his blending of philosophy, theology, and narrative. He writes dialogues, letters, sermons, parables, and meditations. He creates characters who embody different existential positions and lets them speak in their own voices. He uses repetition, paradox, and rhetorical questions to engage the reader actively. His prose can be lyrical, humorous, solemn, or polemical, depending on the context. He anticipates postmodern concerns with authorship, voice, and the instability of meaning. Jacques Derrida, for example, has written on Kierkegaard, exploring the structure of gift-giving, secrecy, and the ethical in relation to fear and trembling. Feminist philosophers and theologians have also engaged critically with Kierkegaard, both appreciating his insights into selfhood and inwardness, and questioning his views on gender, marriage, and the role of women. Simone de Beauvoir, in The Second Sex, critiques Kierkegaard's portrayal of women and his assumption that women are less capable of the ethical and religious life. Others have sought to retrieve Kierkegaardian concepts for feminist purposes, arguing that his emphasis on the individual and on inwardness can be separated from the patriarchal assumptions of his time. One of the persistent questions in Kierkegaard scholarship is how to interpret the relationship between the pseudonymous and the signed works. Are the pseudonymous works merely literary experiments, rhetorical exercises, or do they express Kierkegaard's own views? Kierkegaard himself addressed this question in several places, most notably in a work called The Point of View for My Work as an Author, published posthumously. In that work, he claims that his entire authorship has a single aim: to reintroduce Christianity into Christendom, to make it clear what it means to be a Christian. He describes his use of aesthetic and pseudonymous works as a strategy of indirect communication, designed to meet people where they are and gradually lead them toward the religious. He compares himself to a spy in the service of the highest, someone who infiltrates the aesthetic world in order to win people for the ethical and religious. According to this account, the pseudonymous works are not random or inconsistent. They are part of a carefully planned trajectory. Either/or presents the aesthetic and ethical stages. Fear and Trembling introduces the religious paradox. The concluding unscientific postscript articulates the nature of subjective truth and faith. The Sickness unto Death analyzes despair. Practice in Christianity holds up the New Testament ideal. Throughout, Kierkegaard is attempting to provoke the reader into self-examination, into awareness of his own condition, and ultimately into faith. However, many scholars have questioned this retrospective account. They point out that Kierkegaard's claim to have planned everything from the start may be an overstatement, an attempt to impose unity and coherence on a body of work that was more exploratory and open-ended than he later admitted. They note that the pseudonyms often contradict each other, that they take positions Kierkegaard himself explicitly disavowed, and that he insisted readers should not attribute the views of the pseudonyms to him personally. Some scholars argue that the pseudonyms should be taken seriously as independent voices, that the authorship is genuinely polyphonic, and that Kierkegaard's own position remains elusive, hidden behind the masks. Others take a middle position, acknowledging both the strategic use of indirection and the genuine multiplicity of perspectives. They argue that Kierkegaard is both sincere and ironic, both earnest and playful, and that this complexity is part of what makes his work enduringly rich and challenging. Kierkegaard's journals provide another window into his thought. He kept extensive personal journals throughout his life, recording reflections on his reading, his writing projects, his personal struggles, his relationships, and his faith. The journals are not systematic or organized. They are fragmentary, occasional, and intensely personal. Yet they offer invaluable insight into his intentions, his doubts, and his development. In the journals, he wrestles with his calling, his decision to break off the engagement with Regine, his relationship with his father, his melancholy, and his attacks of despair. He also comments on contemporary events, on the state of Danish culture, on theological controversies, and on the reception of his own works. The journals reveal a man of great intensity, intelligence, and sensitivity, someone who was acutely aware of his own contradictions and who lived with a constant sense of vocation. They also reveal a man who suffered, who questioned, who struggled with loneliness and misunderstanding, and who persisted in his work with a kind of stubborn integrity. One of the themes that emerges from the journals and the authorship as a whole is the notion of the religious poet. Kierkegaard often described himself as a poet, not a prophet, not an apostle, not a teacher. A poet, in his usage, is someone who describes an ideal, who evokes a possibility, who points towards something without claiming to embody it. The religious poet does not have authority in the theological sense. He does not command belief or demand obedience. He presents, suggests, invites. He acknowledges his own distance from the ideal. Kierkegaard saw himself in this role. He held up the New Testament standard, but he admitted that he himself fell short. He described the knight of faith, but he did not claim to be one. He analyzed what it means to love the neighbor, but he confessed his own failures in love. This stance is both humble and strategic. It is humble because it avoids hypocrisy and self-righteousness. It is strategic because it respects the reader's freedom. The reader is not being preached at by someone who claims moral or spiritual superiority. The reader is being invited to consider an ideal, to measure himself against it, and to decide for himself what to do. This is consistent with Kierkegaard's emphasis on indirect communication, on the single individual, and on subjective truth. It is also consistent with his critique of the clergy, who claim authority but do not live up to the demands they place on others. Repetition is a concept and a work that deserves further exploration. The book Repetition, published in 1843 under the pseudonym Constantine Constantius, tells the story of a young man who falls in love, becomes engaged, and then realizes he cannot go through with the marriage. He is paralyzed by melancholy and by the sense that he is not suited to the ethical life of commitment and domesticity. Constantin, the narrator, tries to help him by exploring the concept of repetition. Repetition, as Constantin uses the term, is not mere recurrence or the mechanical return of the same. It is a movement forward, a renewal, a receiving back of what has been lost or renounced, but in a transformed way. Constantine contrasts repetition with recollection. Recollection is the Greek mode, exemplified by Plato, in which one looks backward to eternal truths that the soul once knew and has forgotten. Recollection is a movement from time to eternity, from the particular to the universal, from becoming to being. Repetition, by contrast, is the Christian mode. It is a movement from eternity to time, from the universal to the particular, from being to becoming. It is forward-looking, hopeful, and grounded in faith. Repetition is what happens when one makes the leap of faith and receives back, by grace, what one has renounced. It is the movement that Job makes when, after losing everything and enduring terrible suffering, he receives back his fortunes and his family. It is the movement that Abraham makes when, having been willing to sacrifice Isaac, he receives Isaac back. Repetition is the category of existence, the rhythm of life itself. Constantine attempts to test the possibility of repetition by revisiting a trip to Berlin that he had once enjoyed. He stays in the same hotel, goes to the same theatre, eats at the same restaurant, but the experience is not the same. The hotel room is different, the theatre performance disappoints, the food does not taste as good. He concludes that repetition, in the ordinary sense, is impossible. Yet the young man whose story frames Constantin's narrative eventually experiences a kind of repetition when he hears that his former fiancée has married someone else. He is freed from his guilt and his paralysis. He did not get her back, but he got himself back. He is renewed, able to move forward, able to write again. This is not the full religious repetition that Kierkegaard envisions, but it is a hint of it. True repetition, the repetition of faith, comes not from human effort, but from God. It is a gift, a grace, a miracle. It is what makes life possible after loss, meaning possible after despair, hope possible after suffering. It is the opposite of resignation, which gives up the finite and clings to the eternal. Repetition gives up the finite and then receives it back, affirmed and transformed. The notion of irony, which Kierkegaard explored in his dissertation, remains important throughout his work. Irony is a stance, a mode of communication, and a form of freedom. The ironist says one thing and means another. He speaks in contradictions, undermines conventional wisdom, and refuses to be pinned down. Socrates is the master ironist. He claims to know nothing, yet he reveals the ignorance of those who claim to know. He praises his interlocutors while subtly exposing their contradictions. He is never quite serious and never quite joking. Irony, for Kierkegaard, is a necessary moment in the development of the self. It is the critical stance that frees the self from immediate identification with social roles, received opinions, and external authorities. The ironist stands back, questions, doubts, plays. This is liberating, but it is also dangerous. If irony is not overcome, it becomes negative, destructive, a form of nihilism. The perpetual ironist has no commitments, no ground, no seriousness. He is free, but his freedom is empty. He mocks everything, including himself, and in the end he has nothing. Kierkegaard argues that irony must be mastered, which means that it must be incorporated into a higher unity. The ethical and religious person retains the capacity for irony, the ability to question and to criticize, but he also has positive commitments. He knows what he stands for. He has chosen himself. He has faith. Irony becomes a tool, a mode of expression, a way of communicating indirectly, but it is no longer the defining stance of the self. The concept of the moment is another important theme. Kierkegaard distinguishes between the Greek understanding of time and the Christian understanding. For the Greeks, time is a continuum, and the present moment is just one point in that continuum, no more significant than any other. Eternity is timeless, unchanging, and transcends temporal becoming. For Christianity, however, the moment takes on absolute significance because of the Incarnation. In the Incarnation, eternity enters time. God becomes man in a particular moment, in a particular place, in the person of Jesus Christ. This moment is not just one moment among others. It is the fullness of time, the decisive moment in which the eternal and the temporal intersect. For the individual, too, there are decisive moments, moments of choice, of crisis, of revelation. The moment in which one makes the leap of faith, the moment in which one chooses oneself in earnest, the moment in which one encounters Christ and must decide whether to believe. These are not just ordinary moments. They are moments charged with eternal significance. The moment is the atom of eternity, the point at which the individual stands before God and makes a decision that shapes his entire existence. Kierkegaard emphasizes the urgency of the moment. One cannot postpone the decision indefinitely. One cannot wait for perfect knowledge or perfect conditions. The moment calls for a response, here and now, in fear and trembling. The relationship between time and eternity is a recurring theme in Kierkegaard's work. Human existence is stretched between the two. We are temporal beings with finite lives, yet we are also oriented toward the eternal. We are concerned with the immediate, the practical, the worldly, yet we are haunted by questions of ultimate meaning, by the awareness of mortality, by the longing for something beyond the temporal flux. This tension is the source of much of the anxiety and despair that Kierkegaard analyzes. We cannot be content with the temporal alone because we are spirit, and spirit is the synthesis of the temporal and the eternal. Yet we cannot simply leap out of time into eternity because we are embodied, finite, situated in history. The task is to hold the two together, to live in time while relating to eternity, to engage fully with the finite world while maintaining an absolute relation to the absolute. This is what faith makes possible. The knight of faith lives in the temporal world, enjoys its goods, performs his duties, loves his family, yet at the same time he holds all of it in relation to God. He does not despise the temporal, nor does he idolize it. He receives it as a gift, held in trust, returned to God in gratitude and praise. Kierkegaard's concept of the absurd is closely related to his account of faith. The absurd is not simply the irrational or the nonsensical, it is that which contradicts reason, which cannot be mediated or understood, yet which is believed. The Incarnation is the paradigm of the absurd, that God should become man, that the eternal should enter time, that the infinite should become finite. These are logical contradictions. They cannot be resolved by thought, yet the Christian believes them. He believes by virtue of the absurd. This does not mean that faith is blind or arbitrary. It means that faith operates in a realm beyond the reach of reason, a realm where reason encounters its limits and must give way to passion, to decision, to trust. The absurd is the sign of the transcendent, the mark of the wholly other, the indicator that one has reached the boundary of human understanding and must now leap. This leap is not into darkness or chaos. It is into the arms of God, into a relationship that, though it transcends reason, is the most real and most meaningful relationship possible. The absurd for Kierkegaard is not an obstacle to faith, but its precondition. If faith could be comprehended, if it could be proven, if it could be made rational, it would no longer be faith. It would be knowledge. And knowledge in this domain is precisely what we cannot have. Kierkegaard's view of the self as a synthesis has profound implications for ethics, psychology, and spirituality. The self is not a simple substance or a fixed identity. It is a complex, dynamic, and fragile synthesis of opposing elements. It is finite and infinite, temporal and eternal, body and soul, necessity and possibility. Each of these pairs represents a polarity, and the self must hold them in balance. If the self becomes too absorbed in the finite, neglecting the infinite, it loses itself in worldly concerns and forgets its eternal destiny. If the self becomes too absorbed in the infinite, neglecting the finite, it loses touch with reality and becomes abstract, detached, ungrounded. Similarly, if the self becomes too absorbed in possibility, dreaming and imagining without ever actualizing anything, it becomes unreal, a mere phantom. If the self becomes too absorbed in necessity, accepting everything as fate without exercising freedom, it becomes deterministic, resigned, passive. The task of the self is to integrate these polarities, to be both finite and infinite, both temporal and eternal, both necessary and possible, both body and soul. This integration is the work of spirit, and it is achieved through choice, commitment, and faith. The self that succeeds in this integration is transparent, whole, at peace. The self that fails is in despair, torn, at war with itself. Kierkegaard's emphasis on the individual has sometimes been misunderstood as a form of individualism or egoism. This is a misreading. Kierkegaard is not advocating selfishness or isolation. He is advocating selfhood, which is very different. Selfhood means taking responsibility for one's own existence, making one's own choices, cultivating one's own inwardness, and standing before God as a unique, irreplaceable individual. It does not mean ignoring others or valuing oneself above others. In fact, true selfhood makes genuine relationships possible. The person who has no self, who is absorbed in the crowd, who lives only through external roles and identifications, cannot truly relate to another person. He has nothing to give, no center from which to act, no inwardness to share. The person who has become a self, by contrast, can love, can commit, can be faithful, because he has something to give. He has a self. This is why Kierkegaard insists that the single individual is not opposed to community, but is the condition for genuine community. A crowd is not a community. A crowd is an abstraction, a collection of individuals who have lost themselves. A community is a gathering of selves, each responsible, each inward, each relating to the others out of genuine selfhood. The Church, rightly understood, is such a community. It is a gathering of single individuals, each standing before God, each responsible for his own faith, yet also united in love and in common worship. Christendom, by contrast, is a crowd, a mass, an institution in which individuals are submerged and lost. The relation between the individual and society is a recurring tension in Kierkegaard's thought. He is deeply critical of social conformity, of the tyranny of public opinion, of the way in which the crowd crushes individuality. Yet he is not a social anarchist or a hermit. He lived in the city, engaged with contemporary debates, wrote for publication, and cared about the state of Danish culture and church. His critique is not of society as such, but of the leveling, homogenizing forces that reduce individuals to anonymous units, that discourage inwardness and authenticity, that make it difficult to be a self. He recognizes that human beings are social creatures, that we are formed by relationships, language, culture, and history. But he insists that these social dimensions must not obliterate the personal, the inward, the singular. Each person must appropriate his social inheritance for himself, must make it his own, must decide what he believes and how he will live. The person who simply accepts what everyone else accepts, who does what everyone else does, who thinks what everyone else thinks, has not yet become a self. He is living in immediacy, in externality, in illusion. To become a self requires breaking with the crowd, at least inwardly, and taking responsibility for one's own existence. Kierkegaard's language is often paradoxical, and this is deliberate. Paradox is not a failure of thought, but a recognition that some truths exceed the capacity of ordinary logic. The paradox of the incarnation, the paradox of the absurd, the paradox of the single individual who is both utterly alone and in relation to God, these are not puzzles to be solved, but realities to be lived. Kierkegaard uses paradox to jolt the reader out of complacency, to prevent easy resolutions, to keep the tension alive. He does not want the reader to relax into a system or a formula. He wants the reader to remain engaged, questioning, aware of the limits of understanding. This is part of his strategy of indirect communication. If he stated his ideas plainly and systematically, the reader could memorize them, agree with them, and move on without ever being changed. By using paradox, irony, pseudonyms, and narrative, he makes the reader work, struggle, and appropriate the ideas inwardly. The reader cannot simply receive the truth. He must wrestle with it, live with it, make it his own. Kierkegaard's account of sin is distinctive. For him, sin is not primarily a moral category, but an existential and theological one. Sin is the condition of being separated from God, of not willing to be oneself, of despair intensified into defiance or into weakness. Sin is not just particular wrongful acts, though it includes those. Sin is a state of the will, a fundamental orientation of the self away from God. It is original sin, inherited guilt, the condition into which every human being is born. But it is also personal sin, the individual's own choice to remain in that condition, to refuse grace, to persist in despair. Kierkegaard rejects the Pelagian view that human beings can save themselves by moral effort. He insists that we are radically dependent on grace, on God's forgiveness, on the power of the atonement. Yet he also rejects any form of determinism that would remove human responsibility. We are guilty, we are sinners, and we must own that guilt. We must acknowledge our despair, our separation from God, our inability to save ourselves. This acknowledgement is the beginning of faith. It is the recognition of one's need for a saviour. Without this recognition, without this consciousness of sin, grace remains meaningless. One cannot receive forgiveness if one does not know that one needs it. The atonement, the cross, the suffering of Christ, these are central to Kierkegaard's understanding of Christianity, yet he does not develop a systematic theory of atonement. He is more interested in what it means for the individual to relate to the atonement, to appropriate it inwardly. Christ's suffering is not just a historical event, it is a present reality, a call to discipleship, a model to be imitated. To follow Christ means to take up one's own cross, to embrace suffering, to renounce worldly success and approval. It means to live in the tension between the already and the not yet, between the kingdom of God that has come in Christ and the kingdom that is still awaited. It means to live as a stranger in the world, as one who belongs to another realm. This is not masochism or a morbid fascination with suffering. It is a recognition that the Christian life is costly, that faith involves sacrifice, that love requires self-denial. Kierkegaard is reacting against the comfortable bourgeois Christianity of his day, which promised prosperity, respectability, and happiness. He insists that the New Testament promises suffering, persecution, and the cross. To follow Christ is to enter into his sufferings, to share in his rejection, to become a sign of contradiction. At the same time, Kierkegaard is not a pessimist or a nihilist. He affirms life, joy, love, beauty, and the goodness of creation. The knight of faith is not a grim ascetic. He is someone who lives fully, who enjoys the world, who loves deeply, but he holds all of it in relation to God. He knows that it is gift, that it is provisional, that it is not ultimate. He is prepared to give it up if God calls him to do so, and he believes that by virtue of the absurd he will receive it back. This affirmation of life within the framework of faith, this yes to existence held in tension with renunciation, is one of the most attractive and profound aspects of Kierkegaard's thought. It avoids both the shallow optimism that ignores suffering and the nihilistic pessimism that sees existence as meaningless. It acknowledges the tragic dimension of life, the reality of suffering and death, yet it finds meaning, hope, and joy in faith. Kierkegaard's influence on existential theology, particularly on thinkers like Tillich and Bultmann, has been significant. Tillich's concept of the courage to be, the courage to affirm oneself in the face of non-being, anxiety, and despair, is deeply Kierkegaardian. Tillich speaks of the God above God, the ground of being, the ultimate concern, all of which echo Kierkegaard's emphasis on the absolute relation to the absolute. Bultmann's emphasis on existential interpretation, on stripping away the mythological elements of the New Testament to uncover the existential call to authentic existence, likewise draws on Kierkegaard. Bultmann argues that the New Testament is not primarily concerned with conveying historical information or metaphysical doctrine. It is concerned with addressing the individual in his or her existence, calling for decision, faith, and transformation. This is precisely the kind of existential appropriation that Kierkegaard advocated. Both Tillich and Bultmann, however, have been criticized for overemphasizing the subjective and existential at the expense of the objective and historical. This is a tension within Kierkegaardian thought itself. Kierkegaard insists that faith is not dependent on historical evidence, yet he also affirms that Christianity is rooted in a historical event, the Incarnation. How to hold these two together remains a contested question in Kierkegaard scholarship and in theology more broadly. Another area where Kierkegaard's influence is felt is in the dialogue between philosophy and theology. He challenges the neat separation between the two. He is both a philosopher and a theologian, or perhaps neither in the conventional sense. He does philosophy in a theological key, and he does theology with philosophical rigor. He shows that existential questions, questions about how to live, questions about meaning and truth, cannot be neatly divided into philosophical and theological domains. They are human questions, and they demand responses that engage the whole person. This has inspired a wide range of thinkers to work at the intersection of philosophy and theology, to take seriously both the demands of reason and the call of faith, to refuse reductionism in either direction. Kierkegaard's writings on politics are less developed than his writings on religion and existence, but they are not absent. He is suspicious of mass movements, of revolutionary ideologies, of utopianism. He believes that true change begins with the individual, with inward transformation, not with external revolution. He is critical of the levelling tendencies of modern democracy, which he sees as promoting mediocrity and conformity rather than excellence and individuality. Yet he is not an advocate of authoritarianism or elitism. He is an advocate of the single individual, and he believes that every person, regardless of social status, has the capacity and the responsibility to become a self. His politics, such as they are grounded in his ethics and his theology. He believes that the most important work happens inwardly, in the hidden recesses of the heart, and that social and political life are secondary to the primary task of existing before God. This has led some to criticize him as apolitical or even reactionary. Others argue that his emphasis on the individual and on inwardness is itself a political stance, a refusal to be co-opted by ideologies, a form of resistance to totalizing systems. In the realm of aesthetics, Kierkegaard has much to say, particularly in Either-or and in his reflections on music, literature and drama. He analyzes Mozart's Don Giovanni as the perfect expression of the aesthetic life, the life of immediacy and sensuality. He reflects on the tragic hero in ancient drama, on the differences between ancient and modern tragedy, on the role of irony and humor in art. He uses literary forms creatively, blending philosophy with narrative, argument with confession, analysis with poetry. He shows that philosophy does not have to be dry or technical, that it can be beautiful, engaging, and deeply personal. His own writing is a work of art, carefully crafted, stylistically varied, rich in imagery and allusion. This has made him a favorite among literary scholars and creative writers who appreciate his artistry as much as his ideas. Kierkegaard's relationship with Regine Olsen remained a source of pain and reflection throughout his life. He never married. He never had another serious romantic relationship. He continued to love her, or at least to be haunted by the memory of her, until his death. He saw her occasionally in Copenhagen, and these encounters were agonizing for him. He wrote about her, sometimes directly, sometimes obliquely, in his works. She appears as the beloved in repetition, as the object of the young man's impossible love. She is the hidden presence behind many of the reflections on love, on renunciation, on the collision between the aesthetic and the ethical, between the universal and the singular. Some scholars interpret Kierkegaard's entire authorship as an elaborate communication addressed to Regine, an attempt to explain himself, to justify his decision, to ask for forgiveness, or to show her that he loved her more deeply than she could know. Others see this as overstatement, as reducing the philosophical and theological richness of the work to a private drama. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The broken engagement was undoubtedly a formative event in Kierkegaard's life, one that shaped his thinking about love, commitment, guilt, and renunciation. But it was also one event among others, and the authorship addresses universal questions that transcend his personal circumstances. The theme of suffering is woven throughout Kierkegaard's work. He distinguishes between different kinds of suffering. There is ordinary suffering, the pain and hardship that come with being human in a fallen world. There is the suffering that comes from sin, from guilt, from separation from God. There is the suffering that comes from the ethical life, the burden of responsibility, the weight of duty. There is the suffering that comes from the religious life, the loneliness of faith, the silence of God, the conflict with the world. And there is redemptive suffering, the suffering that is born in faith, in imitation of Christ, as a participation in the cross. Kierkegaard does not offer easy consolations or quick solutions to suffering. He does not promise that faith will remove suffering or that God will intervene to make everything right in this life. He promises only that suffering, when held in relation to God, can have meaning. It can be a means of growth, of purification, of deepening faith. It can be an occasion for learning patience, humility, and trust. It can be a way of becoming more fully human, more fully a self. This is not to glorify suffering or to seek it out. It is simply to acknowledge that suffering is an inevitable part of existence, and that the question is not whether one will suffer, but how one will suffer, whether in despair or in faith. Kierkegaard's concept of the edifying, which he uses to describe his signed religious discourses, is important. Edifying means building up, strengthening, encouraging. The edifying discourses are not sermons in the traditional sense. They do not claim ecclesial authority. They are not delivered from a pulpit. They are written meditations, addressed to that single individual, intended to help the reader in his or her inward life. They explore themes like patience, love, suffering, forgiveness, and trust. They are devotional, pastoral, gentle. They complement the more rigorous and challenging pseudonymous works. Where the pseudonymous works provoke, question, and unsettle, the edifying discourses comfort, encourage, and support. Together, they represent the two sides of Kierkegaard's communicative strategy. He wants to disturb those who are complacent and to console those who are struggling. He wants to make it more difficult to be a Christian in a superficial way and to make it easier to be a Christian in a serious way. This dual aim runs through his entire authorship. The concept of governance, or providence, appears often in Kierkegaard's journals and in his religious discourses. He believes deeply in God's providence, in the idea that God governs the world and that everything that happens, even suffering and apparent setbacks, is under God's care. This belief sustained him through his own struggles, his loneliness, his conflicts with the church and the press, his declining health. He interprets his life as having been guided by God, as having been given a particular vocation, as having been equipped by suffering and melancholy for his task. He sees even his father's melancholy, the early deaths in his family, and the broken engagement with Regine as part of God's plan for him. This is not fatalism. Kierkegaard maintains that human beings are free, that they make choices, that they are responsible. But he also believes that God works through and with human freedom, shaping events toward divine purposes. This paradox of divine sovereignty and human freedom is one he does not try to resolve. He holds it in tension as he holds so many other paradoxes. Kierkegaard's attack on the press and on journalism in general is a recurring theme in his later writings. He sees the press as an instrument of the crowd, as a force that promotes superficiality, sensationalism, and conformity. The press reduces complex issues to slogans, reduces individuals to stereotypes, and reduces truth to public opinion. It is anonymous, irresponsible, and destructive. Kierkegaard himself was the target of a satirical weekly called The Corsair, which mocked him relentlessly in caricatures and articles. The attacks were personal and cruel, focusing on his appearance, his eccentricities, and his broken engagement. Kierkegaard suffered greatly from this public ridicule. It made him a laughingstock in Copenhagen and intensified his sense of isolation. Yet he also reflected on the experience as revealing something important about modern society, about the power of the press to shape perception, to destroy reputations, and to enforce conformity. He saw the press as an enemy of inwardness, of individuality, of seriousness. This critique anticipates later concerns about mass media, about the culture industry, about the ways in which communication technologies can degrade public discourse and manipulate opinion. Kierkegaard's final days were marked by a strange serenity. He knew he was dying. He refused to retract or soften his attack on the church. When friends visited him in the hospital, he spoke calmly about his convictions, about his confidence in God, about his hope for eternity. He declined to receive communion from a pastor, saying that he would receive it only from a layman because the clergy had betrayed the gospel. This refusal was consistent with his critique of the priesthood, but it also scandalized many and added to the controversy surrounding his death. He died on November 11th, 1855, peacefully, according to witnesses. His funeral was a scene of conflict. The church conducted the service, but his brother Peter, who was himself a bishop, did not officiate. A nephew of Kierkegaard's stood up during the service to protest that the church had no right to claim Kierkegaard, given his explicit rejection of the established church. The protest was shouted down, but it captured the ambiguity of Kierkegaard's legacy. Was he a faithful Christian, a heretic, a prophet, a madman? The question was not settled then, and it has not been settled since. In the decades after his death, Kierkegaard's work slowly found an audience beyond Denmark. Translations into German began in the 1860s, and by the turn of the 20th century, his influence was beginning to be felt in German philosophy and theology. The existentialist movement of the mid-20th century brought him to prominence on an international scale. His works were translated into French, English, Spanish, and many other languages. Commentaries, interpretations, and critiques proliferated. Kierkegaard became a canonical figure, studied in universities, cited in sermons, invoked in debates. Yet he also remained elusive, resistant to easy categorization, a thinker who challenges every attempt to domesticate him or to enlist him in a particular cause. He is claimed by Christians and by atheists, by conservatives and by radicals, by individualists and by communitarians. Each finds something in his work that speaks to them, and each finds something that troubles them. One of the enduring insights of Kierkegaard's work is the recognition that truth is not just a matter of correct propositions, but a matter of how one lives. This is the heart of his concept of subjective truth. It is not that objective truth does not exist or does not matter. It is that for the deepest and most important questions of life, objective truth is not sufficient. One can know all the right answers and still live in error if one does not appropriate those answers inwardly, if one does not let them shape one's existence. This insight has implications for education, for religion, for philosophy, and for personal life. It calls into question the model of learning as the passive reception of information. It calls for a pedagogy that engages the whole person, that invites decision and commitment, that respects the learner's subjectivity. It calls for a spirituality that is not content with correct belief, but seeks transformation of the heart. It calls for a philosophy that does not hide behind abstractions, but addresses the concrete reality of human existence. Kierkegaard's emphasis on the importance of inwardness, of the hidden life, of the secret relationship with God, is a corrective to the externalism and activism of much modern culture. We live in a world that values visibility, productivity, achievement, and public recognition. We are encouraged to present ourselves, to perform, to curate our image, to accumulate followers and likes. In such a world, Kierkegaard's insistence that the most important things happen inwardly, in silence, in hiddenness, is countercultural and challenging. He reminds us that character is formed in solitude, that integrity is tested when no one is watching, that faith is not a matter of public display, but of private commitment. He challenges the assumption that more activity, more communication, more engagement is always better. Sometimes he suggests less is more. Sometimes the task is to withdraw, to be silent, to reflect, to pray. Sometimes the highest form of action is inward, invisible, known only to God. Kierkegaard's account of the relationship between philosophy and Christianity remains provocative. He insists that Christianity is not a philosophy, not a set of doctrines to be understood, not a worldview to be adopted. It is a way of life, a relationship with God, a radical call to discipleship. Philosophy deals with concepts, with arguments, with systems. Christianity deals with persons, with faith, with paradox. Philosophy seeks to understand. Christianity calls for obedience. Philosophy is universal, addressing the rational subject. Christianity is particular, addressing the single individual in his or her concrete existence. This does not mean that philosophy and Christianity are incompatible. It means that they operate in different registers, and that the attempt to reduce Christianity to philosophy, to make it rational and comprehensible, is a betrayal of its essence. At the same time, Kierkegaard does philosophy. He thinks rigorously, argues carefully, analyzes concepts. He shows that philosophy can serve faith, not by proving it, but by clarifying the conditions under which faith is possible, by exposing the illusions that prevent faith, by pointing to the existential questions that faith addresses. The relevance of Kierkegaard's thought to contemporary life is multifaceted. In an age of information overload, of constant distraction, of superficial communication, his call to inwardness and to the examined life is urgent. In an age of relativism and pluralism, his insistence on commitment, on choice, on the single individual taking responsibility for his or her own existence is needed. In an age of materialism and consumerism, his emphasis on the spiritual, on the eternal, on the relationship with God offers an alternative. In an age of anxiety, his analysis of anxiety as the condition of freedom, as the dizziness that accompanies the task of becoming a self, provides insight and perspective. In an age of despair, his account of despair as the sickness unto death, as the condition of not willing to be oneself or of willing to be oneself in defiance, offers both diagnosis and hope. In an age of comfortable religion, his attack on Christendom, his call to radical discipleship, his insistence on the costliness of faith is a prophetic challenge. Kierkegaard's thought also speaks to the experience of modernity, of alienation, of fragmentation, of the loss of meaning. He diagnosed these conditions long before they became the dominant themes of 20th century literature and philosophy. He saw that the rise of mass society, of urbanization, of industrialization, of the press, of democratic leveling, was eroding the conditions for authentic selfhood. He saw that people were becoming lost in the crowd, absorbed in externals, estranged from their own inwardness. He saw that traditional sources of meaning, such as religion and community, were being hollowed out, replaced by abstractions and institutions. He did not have solutions in the sense of social programs or political reforms. His solution, such as it was the call to the single individual to take responsibility for his or her own existence, to choose, to commit, to live before God rather than before the crowd. This is not a solution that can be implemented on a large scale. It is a solution that each person must work out for himself or herself. This is both the strength and the limitation of Kierkegaard's thought. It is deeply personal, deeply inward, and it resists translation into collective action or policy. One of the questions that Kierkegaard's work raises is whether genuine community is possible in modernity, or whether the single individual is condemned to isolation. Kierkegaard himself lived a solitary life. He never married, never had children, never joined a party or a movement. He was estranged from the church, mocked by the press, misunderstood by his contemporaries. He described himself as a solitary bird, as an exception, as someone who did not fit into the ordinary patterns of social life. Yet he also wrote extensively about love, about the neighbour, about the duty to relate to others. He did not advocate isolation for its own sake. He advocated inwardness as the condition for genuine relationship. The person who has no self cannot truly love. The person who has become a self can, so the trajectory is not away from others, but through oneself to others. First, become a self. Then love. First, stand alone before God. Then stand with others in community. This is a demanding path, and it is not clear how often it is successfully traversed. But it is the path that Kierkegaard sets before us. Kierkegaard's work, for all its difficulty and complexity, has a certain simplicity at its core. The central question is, how should one live? The central answer is, in faith, in love, in earnestness, as a self before God. Everything else, all the philosophical analysis, all the psychological insight, all the theological reflection, all the polemics and paradoxes, serves this simple question and this simple answer. Kierkegaard wants to help people to live authentically, to exist inwardly, to take their lives seriously, to make choices with full awareness of what is at stake, to relate to God in faith and to the neighbour in love. This is the task of human existence, and it is a task that is never complete, that must be renewed every day, that requires constant vigilance and effort. It is also a task that is ultimately not accomplished by human effort alone, but by grace, by the power of God working in and through the individual. Kierkegaard holds both sides of this paradox. He insists on human responsibility, on the necessity of choice and commitment. He also insists on divine grace, on the forgiveness of sins, on the dependence of the self on the power that established it. In the end, Kierkegaard remains a figure who cannot be summarized or reduced. His thought is too rich, too paradoxical, too personal. He speaks to different readers in different ways. Some find in him a challenge to their complacency, a call to take faith seriously. Some find in him an ally in their critique of institutional religion, of authoritarianism, of dogmatism. Some find in him a profound psychologist, someone who understands anxiety, despair, melancholy, and the inner life better than almost any other thinker. Some find in him a brilliant stylist, a literary artist, a master of irony and indirection. Some find in him a troubling elitism, a problematic view of gender, a lack of social concern. All of these readings have some validity. Kierkegaard is many things, and his work invites many responses. What is clear is that he cannot be ignored. His questions are too important, his insights too penetrating, his voice too distinctive. He asks us to examine our lives, to consider what we believe and why, to take responsibility for our existence, to choose, to commit, to live in earnest. These are questions that every generation must face, and Kierkegaard's contribution to the conversation remains indispensable. The legacy of Søren Kierkegaard is not a finished system, not a set of doctrines, not a school of thought. It is a style of thinking, a mode of questioning, a provocation, an invitation. It is the insistence that philosophy must be existential, that theology must be personal, that truth must be lived. It is the recognition that the most important questions cannot be answered abstractly, that they must be worked out by each individual in the laboratory of his or her own life. It is the call to inwardness in an age of externality, to seriousness in an age of distraction, to commitment in an age of endless options. It is the reminder that to be human is to be a self, and that to be a self is a task, a burden, a privilege, and a joy. Kierkegaard devoted his short life to exploring what it means to be a self, to exist before God, to choose, to believe, to love, and to suffer. His work is the record of that exploration, and it remains a resource for anyone who takes up the same questions. One aspect of Kierkegaard's authorship that deserves further attention is his use of humour. This might seem surprising, given the seriousness and even the melancholy that pervade much of his work. Yet humour is a recurring theme and a recurring mode. Kierkegaard distinguishes between irony and humour as stages in the movement toward faith. Irony, as we have seen, is the negative freedom that questions and undermines. Humour is a higher stage. The humorist has a sense of the incongruity between the finite and the infinite, between human pretensions and human limitations, between what we are and what we aspire to be. The humorist laughs, but the laughter is gentle, sympathetic, and tinged with sadness. It is not the cruel mockery of the ironist. It is the rueful recognition of the human condition. Humour, for Kierkegaard, is the boundary of the religious. The humorist sees the absurdity of existence, the gap between the ideal and the real, but he does not yet make the leap of faith. He remains on the outside, looking in, aware of the religious, but not committing to it. The religious person retains the capacity for humour, the ability to see the incongruities and to laugh at them, but he has also made the leap, and his humour is now informed by faith. The knight of faith can laugh at himself, at his own pretensions, at the oddity of his position, because he knows that he is held by God. His humour is a form of freedom, a sign that he does not take himself too seriously, that he rests in grace rather than in his own achievements. Kierkegaard's own writing is often humorous, though the humour is sometimes subtle and easy to miss. The concluding unscientific postscript, for example, is filled with ironic asides, playful exaggerations, and comic reversals. The very title is a joke. The postscript is much longer than the work it is supposed to be a postscript to, Philosophical Fragments. Climacus, the pseudonymous author, frequently mocks the pretensions of speculative philosophers, imagines absurd scenarios, and adopts a tone of exaggerated modesty that is itself ironic. The humour serves a purpose. It prevents the reader from taking the book as a new dogmatic system. It keeps the tone light even as the content is serious. It models the kind of existential lightness that comes from not being bound to systems and abstractions. Humour, in Kierkegaard's hands, is a form of indirect communication, a way of engaging the reader without imposing authority, a way of making serious points without solemnity. The question of authority is central to Kierkegaard's self-understanding. He repeatedly insists that he writes without authority. He is not an apostle, not a prophet, not a priest. He does not claim divine inspiration or ecclesial ordination. He is, as he says, merely a poet, a thinker, someone who points, who suggests, who provokes. This stance is both humble and strategic. It is humble because it acknowledges his own distance from the ideal, his own sinfulness, his own inability to live up to the demands he articulates. It is strategic because it protects the freedom of the reader. If Kierkegaard claimed authority, the reader might feel obligated to accept his views out of deference. By disclaiming authority, Kierkegaard forces the reader to engage with the ideas themselves, to decide for himself whether they are true, to take responsibility for his own appropriation. This is consistent with his emphasis on indirect communication, on the maieutic method, on respecting the subjectivity of the reader. It is also consistent with his critique of the clergy, who claim authority, but, in his view, do not live up to it. Kierkegaard would rather have no authority and be honest than claim authority and be a hypocrite. The relationship between Kierkegaard and Socrates is worth exploring further. Socrates is the paradigm of the ethical existential thinker, the one who knows that he does not know, the one who questions rather than asserts, the one who lives what he teaches. Socrates was condemned to death for impiety and for corrupting the youth, but he accepted the verdict with equanimity, drank the hemlock, and died with courage and integrity. He became a martyr for truth, for philosophy, for the examined life. Kierkegaard sees in Socrates a model for his own vocation. Like Socrates, he is a gadfly, stinging the complacent, asking uncomfortable questions, refusing to let people rest in their illusions. Like Socrates, he practices indirect communication, using irony and questioning to provoke insight rather than delivering dogmatic instruction. Like Socrates, he stands alone, misunderstood and mocked by his contemporaries. Yet Kierkegaard also recognizes the limits of the Socratic position. Socrates represents the highest possibility of human reason and human ethics. He is the ideal human being, the one who lives according to the light of natural reason and moral conscience. But Socrates does not have faith. He does not know Christ. He does not have access to revelation or grace. His position is tragic, noble, but ultimately insufficient. The Christian goes beyond Socrates. The Christian knows what Socrates did not know, that human beings are sinners, that reason is not enough, that grace is necessary. The Christian makes the leap that Socrates could not make, the leap into the absurd, into faith, into relationship with the God-man. Kierkegaard reveres Socrates, but he also sees that Christianity represents a qualitatively different and higher possibility. The concept of the single individual versus the crowd or the public is one of Kierkegaard's most powerful critiques of modernity. The crowd for Kierkegaard is untruth. This is a strong statement. He does not mean that everything a crowd believes is false. He means that the crowd as such, the collective, the mass, is a category that effaces individuality, responsibility, and inwardness. In a crowd, people lose themselves. They become anonymous. They do what everyone else does, think what everyone else thinks, say what everyone else says. There is safety in the crowd, conformity, the comfort of not having to stand out. But there is also cowardice, irresponsibility, and untruth. The crowd can commit atrocities that no individual would commit alone. The crowd can hold beliefs that no individual, thinking for himself, would hold. The crowd has no conscience, no inwardness, no soul. It is an abstraction, a phantom. The single individual, by contrast, is concrete, particular, responsible. The single individual stands alone before God. He cannot hide in the crowd. He cannot blame others for his choices. He must decide, must choose, must take responsibility. This is difficult, lonely, and frightening. But it is the only way to be a self, the only way to exist in truth. Kierkegaard's critique of the crowd is not an argument for isolation or for despising others. It is an argument for taking individual responsibility, for thinking for oneself, for refusing to let the collective dictate one's beliefs and actions. It is a call to integrity, to authenticity, to courage. The concept of the public, which Kierkegaard discusses particularly in his later writings, is related to the crowd but has its own specific character. The public is an abstraction created by the press, by journalism, by modern mass communication. It is not a gathering of actual people. It is an imagined collective, a phantom audience, an entity that supposedly has opinions and interests, but that cannot be located anywhere. Politicians appeal to the public. Journalists write for the public. But who is the public? It is everyone and no one. It is an idea, not a reality. Kierkegaard sees the concept of the public as deeply problematic because it encourages people to think of themselves as part of this abstract collective rather than as individuals. It encourages conformity to what the public supposedly thinks or wants. It gives power to the press to shape opinion, to create the illusion of consensus, to punish those who deviate. The public is, in Kierkegaard's analysis, a leveling force. It reduces everything to the same level, to the lowest common denominator. It resists excellence, individuality, passion. It promotes mediocrity, superficiality, and irresponsibility. The single individual must resist the tyranny of the public, must refuse to be defined by public opinion, must live according to his own inward convictions. Kierkegaard's concept of the moment and its relation to eternity has profound implications for how we understand time and history. In the Greek view, as Kierkegaard understands it, time is cyclical, or simply a neutral medium in which events occur. The eternal is timeless, outside of time unchanging. The goal of the philosopher is to escape time, to ascend to the eternal through recollection or contemplation. In the Christian view, by contrast, time is linear and meaningful. It has a beginning and an end. It is the arena of history, of divine action, of human decision. The eternal enters time in the incarnation, and this creates the possibility of the moment, the decisive instant in which eternity and time intersect. For the individual, the moment is the now in which one must decide, the present instant in which one encounters God and must respond. One cannot postpone the decision. One cannot wait for a better moment. The moment is now, and it demands a response. This gives time a seriousness and an urgency that it does not have in the Greek view. Every moment is potentially a moment of decision, a moment in which one's eternal destiny is at stake. This is why Kierkegaard emphasizes the importance of living in the present, of being fully engaged with the now, of not losing oneself in abstract speculation about the past or the future. The relationship between necessity and possibility is another polarity that Kierkegaard explores. Necessity refers to what must be, to what is determined, to the constraints and limits of existence. Possibility refers to what might be, to what is open, to freedom and potentiality. The self must hold both in balance. If the self becomes lost in necessity, it experiences despair of the finite. It feels trapped, determined, without freedom. It sees itself as merely a product of circumstances, of genetics, of social conditioning. It loses sight of its freedom and its responsibility. If the self becomes lost in possibility, it experiences despair of the infinite. It dreams, imagines, fantasizes, but never actualizes anything. It loses touch with the concrete reality of its situation. It becomes unreal, a phantom. The healthy self recognizes both necessity and possibility. It accepts the constraints of its situation, its body, its history, its finitude. But it also recognizes its freedom, its capacity to choose, its openness to the future. It lives in the tension between the two, neither resigned to fate nor lost in fantasy, but actively engaging with reality and shaping its own existence within the limits of what is possible. Kierkegaard's account of conscience is another important theme. Conscience is the voice of the self to the self, the inner witness, the seat of moral awareness. Conscience can be a source of guilt, of self-accusation, of torment. But it can also be a source of guidance, of integrity, of moral clarity. Kierkegaard sees conscience as fundamentally related to the self's relationship with God. Conscience is not just an internalized social code. It is the self's awareness of being accountable to God, of being seen by God, of being judged by God. This gives conscience its seriousness and its authority. One cannot escape conscience by escaping society. One can suppress it, ignore it, rationalize away its accusations, but it remains. To have a good conscience is not to be sinless. It is to be in right relation to God, to have confessed one's sins, to have received forgiveness, to be transparent. To have a bad conscience is to be in a wrong relation, to be hiding something, to be guilty and not yet forgiven. Kierkegaard's analysis of conscience is psychologically acute. He understands the mechanisms of self-deception, the ways in which people avoid confronting their own guilt, the ways in which they justify themselves or project their guilt onto others. He also understands the danger of an overly scrupulous conscience, the kind of neurotic guilt that paralyzes and torments without leading to genuine repentance and healing. The healthy conscience is honest, clear, and grounded in faith and grace. The theme of freedom recurs throughout Kierkegaard's work, but it is a complex and paradoxical freedom. Freedom is not simply the ability to do what one wants. It is the ability to become oneself, to choose oneself, to take responsibility for one's existence. Freedom is a task, not a given. It is something that must be achieved through struggle, through choice, through commitment. Freedom is also inseparable from anxiety. To be free is to be aware of possibilities, to be aware that one must choose, and that every choice forecloses other possibilities. This awareness brings anxiety, the dizziness of freedom. Moreover, freedom is not autonomous in the sense of being self-grounding. The self does not create itself. The self is a derived relation established by God. True freedom is found not in autonomy, but in dependence, in resting transparently in the power that established the self. This is a paradox. One becomes free by accepting one's dependence. One achieves autonomy by recognizing one's creaturely status. This paradox is resolved, or at least lived in faith. The person of faith is both radically free and radically dependent. He chooses himself, takes responsibility, lives with passion and commitment. But he also acknowledges that his existence is gift, that his freedom is given, that he is held by God. Kierkegaard's critique of objectivity is not a rejection of science or empirical knowledge. He recognizes that objective knowledge has its place and its value. His critique is directed at the pretense that objective knowledge is sufficient for all purposes, particularly for existential and religious purposes. He argues that there are questions that objectivity cannot answer, questions about how to live, about what to believe, about what to commit to. For these questions, the objective approach is not just insufficient, it is misleading. It gives the illusion that one can stand outside one's own existence, that one can survey all the options neutrally, that one can make a decision based on complete information and rational calculation. But existential decisions do not work that way. They require risk, commitment, passion. They cannot be made from a neutral standpoint because there is no neutral standpoint. To exist is to be engaged, to be situated, to have a perspective. The attempt to be purely objective about one's own existence is a form of evasion, a way of avoiding the responsibility of choosing. Kierkegaard wants to restore the subjective, the personal, the passionate to their rightful place in human life. He does not want to eliminate objectivity, but to subordinate it to subjectivity, to recognize that for the most important questions, how one knows is more important than what one knows. The concept of the God relationship is central to Kierkegaard's religious thought. The God relationship is not one relationship among others. It is the absolute relationship, the one that determines all others. To be a self is to be in relation to God, whether one acknowledges it or not. The self is constituted by this relationship. When the relationship is right, transparent, grounded in faith, the self is healthy. When the relationship is wrong, broken, characterized by despair or defiance, the self is sick. The God relationship is personal, direct, inward. It is not mediated by institutions, by priests, by doctrines, though these can play a supporting role. It is a matter of the heart, of the will, of faith. One cannot have a God relationship by proxy, by belonging to a church, by inheriting a tradition. One must stand before God as a single individual, in fear and trembling, and make one's own response. This emphasis on the personal God relationship is one of the most characteristic features of Kierkegaard's Christianity. It is deeply Protestant, shaped by the Reformation emphasis on faith alone, on Scripture alone, on the priesthood of all believers. But it goes beyond the typical Protestant emphasis. It is more radical, more inward, more critical of ecclesial mediation. It is a form of Christian individualism, though not in the sense of egoism or subjectivism. It is individualism in the sense of personal responsibility, of direct relationship with God, of refusal to hide behind collective identity. Kierkegaard's view of prayer is implied rather than extensively developed, but it is consistent with his overall emphasis on inwardness and relationship. Prayer is not primarily petition, asking God for things, though it can include that. Prayer is communion, conversation, presence. It is the self speaking to God, listening to God, being with God. It is the expression of the God relationship. It is how the self relates inwardly to the absolute. Kierkegaard's own prayers, some of which appear at the beginning of his Edifying Discourses, are simple, earnest, and humble. They express gratitude, confession, longing, trust. They are not formulaic or ritualistic. They are deeply personal, even though they are written for publication. They model a kind of prayer that is direct, honest, and unadorned. They reflect his conviction that prayer is a matter of the heart, not of correct words or proper forms. The theme of silence appears repeatedly in Kierkegaard's work. Silence is the condition of inwardness, of reflection, of genuine communication with God. In a noisy, talkative world, silence is rare and difficult, yet it is essential. Silence is not merely the absence of speech. It is a positive quality, a form of attention, a mode of being. The person who cannot be silent cannot be inward. The person who is always talking, always performing, always reacting to external stimuli, has no center, no depth. Silence is also connected to the hiddenness of faith. The knight of faith does not advertise his faith. He is silent about it. He does not try to prove himself or to impress others. He lives before God in silence. Abraham, in fear and trembling, is silent. He cannot explain to anyone what he is doing or why. His action is incomprehensible from the outside. He must bear it in silence. Silence is thus both a burden and a privilege. It is a burden because it means isolation, the inability to be understood. It is a privilege because it preserves the intimacy and the seriousness of the relationship with God. Kierkegaard's understanding of original sin is traditional in one sense and distinctive in another. He affirms the Christian doctrine that human beings are born into a state of sin, that we inherit a sinful nature from Adam, that we are guilty before we commit any actual sins. He also affirms that sin is not just a matter of particular acts, but a condition of the will, a state of being separated from God. Where he is distinctive is in his emphasis on the individual appropriation of sin. Sin is not just inherited, it is also chosen. Each person, in his or her own existence, reenacts the fall. Each person becomes guilty, not just because of Adam's sin, but because of his own. This happens through anxiety, through freedom, through the leap from innocence to guilt. Kierkegaard's account of the fall in The Concept of Anxiety is psychological and existential rather than historical. He is not primarily interested in what happened in the Garden of Eden long ago. He is interested in what happens in the life of every human being, in the moment when freedom becomes aware of itself, when possibility becomes actual, when innocence is lost. This makes sin both universal and personal, both inherited and chosen. It preserves both the solidarity of the human race in sin and the responsibility of each individual. The concept of offense, which we touched on earlier, is worth further exploration. Offense is a stumbling block, a scandal, something that provokes rejection or hostility. Christ is the offense par excellence. He offends by his lowliness, by his claim to be God, by his paradoxicality. The offense is not accidental or removable, it is essential to the incarnation. To remove the offense would be to remove Christ himself. Faith begins at the point of offense. It is the decision to believe in spite of the offense, to see past the offense to the truth that it conceals. This means that faith is always accompanied by the possibility of offense. The person of faith is always aware that what he believes is offensive to reason, to common sense, to the world. He believes nonetheless. He holds fast to the paradox. He does not try to explain it away or to make it palatable. Kierkegaard is deeply opposed to apologetics, to the attempt to prove Christianity or to make it reasonable. He thinks that such attempts betray the gospel by removing the offense. Christianity is not supposed to be easy to believe. It is supposed to be difficult, paradoxical, offensive. This difficulty is the test of faith, the way faith is distinguished from mere opinion or habit. Kierkegaard's account of forgiveness is profound though not systematically developed. Forgiveness is central to Christian faith. It is the presupposition of the God relationship. The self, aware of its sin and its guilt, cannot relate to God without forgiveness. But forgiveness is not automatic or cheap. It requires confession, repentance, and faith. It requires the acknowledgement of guilt, the willingness to see oneself as a sinner, the humility to receive grace. Kierkegaard is critical of easy forgiveness, of the idea that one can sin and then casually ask for forgiveness without genuine repentance. He is also critical of the idea that forgiveness removes all consequences of sin. Sin wounds, damages, leaves scars. Forgiveness heals, but it does not erase history. The forgiven person remains a sinner, though a justified sinner. He remains aware of his guilt, his need for grace, his dependence on God. This awareness keeps him humble, honest, and open to continuing transformation. Forgiveness, in Kierkegaard's understanding, is not a one-time event, but an ongoing relationship, a continual dying to self and rising to new life. The concept of imitation of Christ, which Kierkegaard explores in practice in Christianity and elsewhere, is important and challenging. To be a Christian is not just to believe certain things about Christ. It is to follow Christ, to imitate his life, to take up one's cross. This means renunciation, suffering, and self-denial. It means living in conflict with the world, accepting misunderstanding and persecution, choosing the narrow way rather than the broad way. Kierkegaard insists that the New Testament presents Christianity as demanding, costly, and difficult. Christendom has softened this, has made Christianity comfortable and respectable, has eliminated the call to imitation. People are content to admire Christ, to honor him, to worship him from a distance. But they do not follow him. They do not imitate him. They do not let his life shape their own. Kierkegaard wants to restore the call to imitation, to remind people that Christianity is a way of life, not just a set of beliefs. This is a controversial and demanding teaching. It raises the question of whether anyone, apart from Christ himself, can actually live up to this standard. Kierkegaard's answer is that no one can, that all fall short, that all need grace. But this does not remove the obligation. The ideal remains, the call remains, and each person must respond to it as honestly and as earnestly as possible. The tension between grace and works is a perennial issue in Christian theology, and Kierkegaard engages with it in his own way. He is firmly on the side of grace. Salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone. Human works cannot earn salvation. The self cannot save itself. Kierkegaard is Lutheran in this respect, yet he is also insistent that genuine faith expresses itself in works, in love, in obedience. Faith is not passive. It is active, passionate, committed. It transforms the whole life. The person of faith does not do works in order to be saved. He does works because he is saved, out of gratitude, out of love, out of the new life that has been given to him. Kierkegaard is critical of a cheap grace that requires nothing, that allows people to continue in sin while claiming to be Christians. He is equally critical of a legalism that turns works into a means of earning God's favor. The balance he seeks is difficult to maintain, and he does not always succeed in articulating it clearly. But the basic insight is sound. Faith and works belong together. They are not alternatives. They are two aspects of the same reality, the reality of life in Christ. Kierkegaard's reflections on death and mortality are pervasive, though not always explicit. He is acutely aware of death. He grew up in a family shadowed by death. He expected to die young, as his siblings had. He lived with a sense of urgency, a sense that time was short. Death is the ultimate limit, the final boundary of existence. It is the event that no one can avoid, that no one can control. It is the great equalizer. In the face of death, all worldly distinctions fade. Wealth, status, power, all of it is meaningless. Death confronts the self with the question of eternity. What happens after death? Is there life beyond the grave? Is there judgment, heaven, hell? These are not abstract questions. They are personal, urgent, existential. How one answers them, or how one relates to them, shapes one's entire existence. Kierkegaard's faith is rooted in the hope of resurrection, in the belief that death is not the end, that there is life eternal with God. This hope gives meaning to suffering, courage in the face of mortality, and perspective on the things of this world. It is not an escape from life, but an affirmation of life in its fullness, a life that transcends death. The concept of hope is closely related. Hope is one of the three theological virtues, along with faith and love. Hope is the forward-looking aspect of faith, the confidence that God will fulfill his promises, that there is a future, that all is not lost. Hope is not wishful thinking or naive optimism. It is grounded in faith, in the character of God, in the promises of Scripture. Hope sustains the self through suffering, through despair, through the dark nights of the soul. It provides a reason to go on, a reason to endure, a reason to believe that meaning is possible even in the midst of meaninglessness. Kierkegaard's own life was marked by hope. Despite his melancholy, despite his suffering, despite his conflicts and his loneliness, he maintained hope. He believed that his work had meaning, that his vocation was real, that God was guiding him. This hope was not always felt. Sometimes it was dark, hidden, held onto by an act of will, but it was there, sustaining him, keeping him going. The theme of joy appears less frequently in Kierkegaard's work than the themes of anxiety and despair, but it is present. Joy is the fruit of faith, the inner gladness that comes from being in right relation to God. Joy is not the same as happiness. Happiness depends on circumstances, on external conditions. Joy is deeper, more stable, more inward. It can coexist with suffering, with sadness, with struggle. The person of faith has joy because he knows that he is loved by God, that he is forgiven, that he is secure in God's hands. This joy is quiet, hidden, not demonstrative. It does not seek to display itself. It is a secret between the self and God. Kierkegaard himself, for all his melancholy, speaks of moments of joy, of gratitude, of wonder. He speaks of the joy of contemplating the beauty of creation, the joy of insight, the joy of prayer. This joy is real, even if it is intermittent, even if it is overshadowed by suffering. It is a sign of grace, a foretaste of eternity, a hint of the blessedness that is promised to those who endure. Kierkegaard's view of the Church is complex and conflicted. On the one hand, he affirms the importance of community, of the gathering of believers, of worship, of the sacraments. He was baptized, confirmed, and raised in the Church. He attended services regularly for most of his life. He wrote extensively on Christian themes. On the other hand, he is deeply critical of the institutional church, especially the Danish state church of his day. He sees it as compromised, worldly, hypocritical. He sees the clergy as careerists more interested in salary and status than in the gospel. He sees the congregation as passive, nominal, going through the motions without genuine faith. In his final years, he launched a fierce attack on the church, questioning its legitimacy, urging people to stop attending services and refusing to receive communion from a priest. Yet even in this attack, he does not reject the idea of the church. He rejects Christendom, the fusion of church and state, the cultural Christianity that has replaced genuine faith. He calls for a return to the New Testament understanding of the church, a gathering of believers who take discipleship seriously, who suffer for their faith, who live in tension with the world. Whether such a church is possible, whether it has ever existed, is an open question. Kierkegaard's critique is more negative than constructive. He is better at pointing out what is wrong than at offering a workable alternative. The relationship between Kierkegaard's personal life and his authorship is a subject of endless fascination and debate. To what extent does his work reflect his own struggles, his own psychology, his own circumstances? To what extent is it universal, addressing the human condition in general? The answer is surely both. Kierkegaard writes out of his own experience, out of his own pain, his own questions, his own faith. The broken engagement with Regine, the complex relationship with his father, the melancholy, the conflicts with the press and the church, the sense of vocation, all of these shape his thinking. Yet he transforms his personal experience into universal categories, into existential analyses that apply to anyone. He uses his own life as a laboratory, as a case study, but he does not remain stuck in the personal. He moves to the general, to the philosophical, to the theological. This is the mark of a great thinker. He is able to see in his own particular experience something that illuminates the experience of all. He is able to speak out of his subjectivity in a way that reaches other subjectivities. Kierkegaard's prose style is distinctive and powerful. He writes with intensity, with passion, with rhetorical skill. He uses repetition, parallelism, rhetorical questions, exclamations, and vivid imagery. He can be lyrical and poetic, as in some of the Edifying Discourses. He can be ironic and playful, as in the postscript. He can be analytical and rigorous, as in The Sickness unto Death. He can be polemical and harsh, as in the attack on Christendom. He varies his style to suit his purpose and his pseudonym. Each pseudonymous work has its own voice, its own tone, its own stylistic signature. This stylistic diversity is part of the indirect communication. It keeps the reader off balance, prevents the formation of fixed expectations, and requires active engagement. Reading Kierkegaard is not a passive experience. It demands attention, interpretation, reflection. The reader must work to understand, to follow the argument, to discern the intent. This is exactly what Kierkegaard wants. He wants the reader to be active, to think, to choose, to appropriate. The question of Kierkegaard's relevance to non-Christians or to people of other faiths is interesting. His work is deeply Christian, grounded in Christian scripture, shaped by Christian theology. Yet many of his insights transcend the specifically Christian context. His analysis of anxiety, despair, choice, freedom, authenticity, the self, all of these have resonance for anyone, regardless of religious commitment. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus, who rejected Christianity, found in Kierkegaard resources for their own thinking. Psychologists, sociologists, and literary critics who may not share his faith have drawn on his work. His emphasis on the individual, on inwardness, on subjective truth, on the importance of how one lives, these themes are universal. At the same time, it is important not to extract Kierkegaard's insights from their religious context and to secularize them in a way that betrays his intent. He wrote as a Christian, for Christians, or for those who might become Christians. His existentialism is theistic, not atheistic. His emphasis on subjectivity is grounded in the God relationship. To ignore this is to misunderstand him. The challenge is to appreciate both the universal and the particular, both the existential and the religious dimensions of his thought. Kierkegaard's concept of the paradox is not just a rhetorical device, it is a genuine philosophical and theological claim. Some truths, particularly the truths of Christian faith, are paradoxical. They involve contradictions that cannot be resolved by logic. The incarnation, that God is man, that the eternal is temporal, is a logical contradiction. The atonement, that the innocent suffers for the guilty, is a moral paradox. The resurrection, that the dead live, is a natural impossibility. Yet Christians believe these things. How is this possible? Kierkegaard's answer is that faith operates beyond the reach of reason. Faith is not irrational in the sense of being arbitrary or capricious, but it is transrational in the sense of transcending the categories and capacities of human reason. The paradox is the marker of this transcendence. It signals that we have reached the boundary of what can be understood and must now leap. This does not mean that reason is useless or that anything goes. Reason has its place, its proper domain. But for the ultimate questions, for the questions of faith, reason must acknowledge its limits and give way to passion, to trust, to commitment. The relationship between Kierkegaard and mysticism is a topic of some debate. He is not a mystic in the traditional sense. He does not seek union with God through contemplation or ecstasy. He does not practice ascetic disciplines or seek visions. He is too Protestant, too dialectical, too conscious of sin and the gap between God and man. Yet there is a mystical strand in his thought. His emphasis on inwardness, on the hidden life, on the direct relationship with God, on the ineffability of faith, all of these have affinities with mysticism. His insistence that the God relationship cannot be mediated, that it must be personal and direct, resonates with the mystical emphasis on immediate experience of the divine. His use of paradox, his recognition that God is wholly other, his awareness of the limits of language, all of these are themes in mystical theology. Perhaps it is best to say that Kierkegaard is a mystical existentialist or an existential mystic, someone who combines the inward experiential dimension of mysticism with the existential ethical dimension of Protestantism. Kierkegaard's understanding of Scripture is important but not always fully articulated. He reads the Bible devotionally, personally, existentially. He is not interested in historical critical questions or in doctrinal disputes about inspiration or inerrancy. He reads Scripture as the Word of God addressed to the individual, calling for response, demanding transformation. He reads it looking for himself, for his own situation, for his own struggles reflected in the text. He practices a kind of existential hermeneutics, interpreting Scripture in terms of its significance for existence. This does not mean that he ignores the literal or historical sense of the text, but it does mean that his primary interest is in what the text says to him now, in his situation. He reads the story of Abraham and Isaac not as ancient history, but as a present challenge. He reads the Sermon on the Mount not as a set of impossible ideals, but as a concrete call to discipleship. He reads the Psalms not as ancient poetry, but as prayers that express his own longings, his own fears, his own faith. This way of reading Scripture is deeply Protestant, shaped by Luther's emphasis on the priesthood of all believers and the individual's direct access to Scripture. But it is also distinctively Kierkegaardian, shaped by his emphasis on subjectivity, on inwardness, on appropriation. The theme of patience appears in several of Kierkegaard's edifying discourses. Patience is a virtue, a fruit of faith, a form of trust. Patience is the ability to endure, to wait, to persist without losing hope. It is the opposite of impatience, of anxiety, of the demand for immediate results. Patience is difficult. It requires faith that God is at work, even when nothing seems to be happening. It requires trust that God's timing is right, even when it does not align with our desires. Patience is not passivity or resignation. It is active waiting, hopeful endurance. The person of faith is patient because he knows that God is faithful, that God's promises are sure, that all will be well in the end. This patience is tested by suffering, by delay, by disappointment, but it endures. It is sustained by faith and by the hope of what is to come. Kierkegaard's reflections on love, as we have seen, are profound and demanding. Love is the highest expression of the ethical and religious life. To love the neighbour as oneself is the commandment, the duty, the task. Yet love is also a gift, a grace, a fruit of the Spirit. One cannot simply decide to love and then do it by force of will. Love must be given, must grow, must be nurtured. Kierkegaard holds both sides of this paradox. Love is commanded, yet it must be freely given. Love is a duty, yet it must be genuine, heartfelt. Love is universal, directed toward every neighbour, yet it is deeply personal, attentive to the particular needs and circumstances of the other. Love is hidden, inward, known only to God, yet it expresses itself in concrete actions, in service, in sacrifice. Love is patient, kind, forgiving, hopeful, yet it is also demanding, truthful, unwilling to tolerate evil. Kierkegaard's account of love avoids sentimentality. He does not romanticize love or reduce it to emotion. He presents it as the most difficult and the most important thing in the world. The concept of the eternal, as opposed to the temporal, is central to Kierkegaard's understanding of the self and of existence. The eternal is that which does not change, that which is beyond time, that which is absolute and infinite. The self is oriented toward the eternal. It cannot be satisfied with the temporal alone. It longs for meaning, for purpose, for something that transcends the fleeting and the contingent. Yet the self is also temporal, finite, embodied. It exists in time, in history, in the concrete particularity of this place and this moment. The task is to hold the two together, to live in time while relating to eternity. This is the synthesis that spirit must achieve. Kierkegaard often speaks of the eternal in the self, the eternal dimension of the self, the capacity for self-transcendence, for relating to the infinite. This is what makes the self-spirit, what makes it human in the full sense. To lose sight of the eternal is to become merely temporal, merely animal, merely a thing among things. To lose sight of the temporal is to become abstract, unreal, detached from the concrete reality of existence. Both are forms of despair. The question of Kierkegaard's influence on literary modernism is worth considering. His fragmented polyphonic style, his use of pseudonyms, his self-reflexive irony, his blending of genres, all of these anticipate modernist techniques. Writers like Kafka, Beckett, and Dostoevsky, though they may not have read Kierkegaard directly, explore similar themes of alienation, anxiety, and the search for meaning in a world without clear foundations. Dostoevsky, in particular, shares Kierkegaard's concern with inwardness, with the self's struggle with freedom and guilt, with the paradoxes of faith. The underground man in Notes from Underground is a figure who could have stepped out of a Kierkegaard text, a man tormented by consciousness, unable to act, caught in endless self-reflection. Kafka's characters are similarly trapped, anxious, unable to find solid ground. Beckett's minimalism, his stark explorations of existence stripped to its essentials, echoes Kierkegaardian themes of despair and endurance. These writers may not be directly influenced by Kierkegaard, but they are working in a similar intellectual and spiritual landscape, grappling with similar questions. Kierkegaard's emphasis on the importance of the teacher or the communicator is also significant. The teacher, in Kierkegaard's understanding, is not a master who imposes knowledge on a passive student. The teacher is a midwife, a helper, someone who assists the learner in discovering the truth for himself. This is the Socratic model, and Kierkegaard adopts it fully. The teacher must respect the freedom and subjectivity of the learner. The teacher must use indirect communication, must provoke rather than inform, must create the conditions for insight rather than delivering it pre-packaged. This has implications for education, for preaching, for all forms of communication. It challenges the authoritarian model in which the teacher knows and the student merely receives. It calls for a dialogical, participatory model in which both teacher and student are engaged in a common search for truth. This is a demanding model. It requires skill, patience, and restraint on the part of the teacher. It requires humility, the willingness to admit that one does not have all the answers, that one is also a learner. Yet it is the model that respects human dignity and freedom. Kierkegaard's reflections on the role of the poet or the artist are also illuminating. The poet is one who imagines, who creates, who evokes possibilities. The poet does not command or dictate. He suggests, points, invites. Kierkegaard sees himself as a poet, as one who describes ideals without claiming to embody them. This stance is both humble and strategic. It allows him to present the highest demands of Christianity without falling into hypocrisy. It allows him to maintain a critical distance, to avoid identifying himself with the voices in his texts. Yet there is also a danger in the poetic stance. The poet can become a mere observer, a describer of life rather than a liver of life. He can become aesthetic, absorbed in imagination, detached from reality. Kierkegaard is aware of this danger. He insists that his poetry is in the service of existence, that it aims to help people to live, not just to imagine. His poetry is dialectical, designed to provoke movement, to lead the reader from the aesthetic through the ethical to the religious. It is not an end in itself, but a means, a tool, a form of communication. The concept of the dialectical is important in Kierkegaard's method. Dialectical thinking involves the movement through opposites, the recognition of contradictions, the refusal of easy syntheses. Kierkegaard is deeply dialectical. He presents the aesthetic and the ethical as opposites, then shows how both are insufficient without the religious. He presents immanence and transcendence, necessity and possibility, time and eternity, always in tension, always in movement. He does not resolve these tensions into a higher unity, as Hegel does. He leaves them in tension, as paradoxes, as the condition of existence. This is a deliberate move. He believes that existence itself is dialectical, that the self is a dialectical synthesis, that faith is a dialectical relation. To flatten out the dialectic, to resolve the contradictions prematurely, is to falsify reality. The task is not to eliminate the tensions, but to live within them, to hold them together, to navigate them with faith and courage. Kierkegaard's use of the category of the aesthetic is also complex. The aesthetic is not just art or beauty, it is a way of life, a mode of existence. The aesthetic individual seeks pleasure, novelty, immediacy. He lives in the moment, avoiding commitment and responsibility. Yet the aesthetic is also necessary. It is the starting point, the sphere of possibility, the realm of imagination and feeling. Without the aesthetic, life would be dry, mechanical, joyless. The task is not to reject the aesthetic, but to transform it, to incorporate it into a higher mode of existence. The ethical person retains the capacity for aesthetic enjoyment, but subordinates it to duty and commitment. The religious person retains both the aesthetic and the ethical, but holds them in relation to God. This is the movement of the stages, not a rejection of the earlier stages, but a transformation and incorporation of them. One of the most powerful images in Kierkegaard's work is the image of the narrow way. Jesus speaks in the Gospels of the narrow way that leads to life and the broad way that leads to destruction. Few find the narrow way, and many take the broad way. Kierkegaard uses this image repeatedly. The narrow way is the way of faith, of discipleship, of self-denial. It is difficult, lonely, and demanding. It requires sacrifice, courage, and perseverance. Most people choose the broad way, the way of conformity, of comfort, of worldliness. They follow the crowd, accept the conventional wisdom, and live for the moment. They may call themselves Christians, but they have not taken up the cross. They have not walked the narrow way. Kierkegaard's entire authorship is a call to the narrow way, a challenge to leave the broad way, a provocation to consider what it really means to be a Christian. This call is not popular. It is not designed to win friends or to gain followers. It is designed to disturb, to unsettle, to force the question, where am I? Am I on the narrow way or the broad way? Am I a genuine Christian or a nominal one? Kierkegaard's understanding of the resurrection is grounded in faith rather than in evidence. He does not argue for the resurrection on historical grounds. He does not try to prove that it happened. He presents it as the ultimate paradox, the ultimate absurdity, the event that can only be believed. The resurrection is the vindication of Christ, the confirmation of his claim to be the Son of God, the foundation of Christian hope. Without the resurrection, Christianity collapses. But the resurrection cannot be known objectively. It is an article of faith. It is believed against all appearances, against all probabilities, by virtue of the absurd. The person who believes in the resurrection believes that death is not the end, that there is life beyond the grave, that God has power over death. This belief shapes one's entire existence. It gives courage in the face of suffering, hope in the face of despair, meaning in the face of meaninglessness. It is the ground of the Christian's confidence that all will be well, that justice will be done, that love will prevail. The concept of the witness, the martyr, is central to Kierkegaard's understanding of true Christianity. The witness is one who testifies to the truth with his life, who suffers for the truth, who is willing to die for the truth. The apostles were witnesses. They saw the risen Christ, and they proclaimed him, and they were persecuted and killed. The early Christians were witnesses. They refused to worship the emperor, and they were martyred. Throughout history, there have been witnesses, people who lived radically, who challenged the powers, who paid the price. Kierkegaard asks, where are the witnesses today? In Christendom, there are no witnesses. The clergy are comfortable. The laity are respectable. No one suffers. No one is persecuted. This, for Kierkegaard, is proof that something is wrong, that what passes for Christianity is not the real thing. Real Christianity produces witnesses. It produces people who are willing to lose everything for the sake of the gospel. The absence of witnesses is the absence of genuine Christianity. Kierkegaard's reflections on suffering, as we have noted, are pervasive. Suffering is not something to be avoided at all costs. It is not simply evil or meaningless. It can be redemptive. It can be a means of growth. It can be a participation in the sufferings of Christ. This does not mean that all suffering is good or that one should seek it out. It means that suffering, when it comes, can be borne in faith, can be endured with patience, can be offered to God. It means that suffering can strip away illusions, can deepen character, can clarify what really matters. It means that the person who suffers in faith is not alone. Christ has suffered. God knows suffering from within. There is solidarity, compassion, presence. This does not remove the pain, but it gives it a context, a frame, a meaning. As we draw toward a close, it is worth reflecting on the overall shape and intent of Kierkegaard's authorship. He began with the aesthetic and ethical, presenting them in either-or. He moved to the religious paradox in Fear and Trembling. He explored the concepts of anxiety, repetition, and the stages of life in subsequent works. He articulated the nature of subjective truth and faith in the concluding unscientific postscript. He analysed despair in The Sickness Unto Death. He explored Christian love in Works of Love. He held up the New Testament ideal in practice in Christianity. He attacked Christendom in his final years. Throughout, he wrote edifying discourses under his own name, providing devotional support alongside the more challenging pseudonymous works. The authorship has a unity, a trajectory, a purpose. It is designed to lead the reader from the aesthetic through the ethical to the religious, to expose illusions, to provoke self-examination, to call for decision and commitment. It is a remarkable achievement, a body of work that is both intellectually rigorous and existentially passionate, both philosophically sophisticated and theologically profound. Kierkegaard lived in a particular time and place, 19th century Copenhagen, and he wrote in response to particular circumstances, the state of the Danish church, the influence of Hegelian philosophy, the rise of mass media and democracy. Yet his work transcends these particular circumstances. He addresses universal questions. What does it mean to be a self? How should one live? What is truth? What is faith? What is love? How does one relate to God? These questions are perennial. They are asked by every generation, by every individual who takes existence seriously. Kierkegaard's answers, or his way of approaching the questions, remain relevant because he refuses to give easy answers. He refuses to offer formulas or systems. He insists that these questions must be worked out by each person in the laboratory of his or her own life. He respects the freedom and the responsibility of the individual. He trusts that if he presents the issues honestly, if he uses indirect communication effectively, if he provokes and challenges rather than imposing, the reader will be able to find his or her own way. In our own time, when so many of the tendencies that Kierkegaard critiqued have intensified, his work remains a vital resource. We live in an age of even greater mass media saturation, of social media that amplifies the crowd mentality, of consumerism that reduces everything to commodities, of relativism that denies objective truth, of secularism that ignores or dismisses the religious dimension of life. We live in an age of anxiety, of depression, of meaninglessness. We live in an age when the single individual is submerged in data, in noise, in endless options, yet paradoxically isolated, lonely, unable to form genuine relationships. Kierkegaard speaks to all of this. He calls us back to ourselves, to inwardness, to seriousness, to responsibility. He calls us to resist the tyranny of the public, the crowd, the algorithm. He calls us to choose, to commit, to live with passion and integrity. He calls us to faith, to hope, to love. He calls us to the narrow way. Søren Kierkegaard died more than a century and a half ago, but his voice has not been silenced. His works continue to be read, studied, debated, and appropriated. New translations appear, new commentaries are written, new interpretations are proposed. Each generation finds something new in his work, something that speaks to its particular concerns and challenges. This is the mark of a classic, a work that transcends its origins and continues to live. Kierkegaard's authorship is such a work. It is not a closed system, not a finished monument, but a living conversation, an ongoing provocation, an invitation to think, to choose, to exist. It is a gift to anyone who is willing to engage with it seriously, to wrestle with its paradoxes, to let it challenge and unsettle. It is a companion for the journey, a guide for those who walk the narrow way, a voice crying in the wilderness, calling us back to the task of becoming ourselves, of existing before God, of living in truth. This is Kierkegaard's legacy, and it endures.